Thank you very much for coming this morning. It's a pleasure to have you. We've designed this workshop with Georgina a few months ago in the context of the AI for Good Summit. Witnessing after 8 years, now it's been 8 years since we started designing the concept of AI for Good, where the idea was to bring together researchers, governance, policymakers, and technologists together to discuss how we can actually create a framework and a roadmap to implement AI for good and for social good. Fast forward 7 years, we have witnessed, and you have all been actors of that, so many examples of applications of AI in healthcare, in education, in climate mitigation, in justice, in poverty mitigation, etc. And while we have done this progress, we believe and we still feel that we have so much more to do. And we are not reaching the momentum that we have in terms of scaling applications that are global, that are national, that are regional, that could do good, and are really supported by either philanthropy or governments in a sustainable manner. So the conversation is that how can we involve more research to be connecting to the real impact, and what are the mechanics for that? So it seems that we need to have more conversation about how stakeholders can come together to really build that impact and find a way to scale up, because scaling is important. Scaling is important because we have to have, of course, safety and mitigation of risk, because we have to have access to proper data, because we have to make sure that there is no bias or ethical issues. So knowing all of what we have observed in the past 7 years collectively, what are the mechanics so we can have a collective action alignment to make sure that the output of research, which is the cornerstone of how AI is built, really impacts directly at the ground level, but also locally, and provide agency to all the countries and regions and individuals that have to own that solutions development. So we have a very full program today. A few panels, we're going to be going through this. I'm going to pass on to Georgina to give you a little bit more details about how we have organized this. And again, welcome and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I'm Georgina Curto, University of Notre Dame, Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society. And first, I want to thank you all for being here. I know some of you have been flying from Jakarta, from South Africa, one person flying all night from the US to be here in the morning. So it's an honor to have you all here. And why are we doing this, right? So we saw yesterday queues of people waiting outside to get in. So there is a hype maybe on AI for good, right? We all want to do good. However, we also know that only 12% of the SDGs are going to be reached. And we have the capacity to actually reach 80% if we use AI in a good way. And as Virginia says, good AI for good, because it's not only using AI for good, it's also using it in a proper way, right? However, then there must be something that we're doing wrong, right? So after observing all this for several years, we realized that in academia, seeing a lot of papers in special tracks, we're missing something. We're producing a lot of papers, and we have good intentions, obviously, but many of these papers don't come to reality. They stay at the stage of a paper, even though we want to implement it, right? In the corporate world, we listened yesterday to Tristan Harris. There is a lot of objective on engagement, and we also want to do good, right? And all of us are trying, but still maybe have not found how to work together. And in the United Nations and other organizations, of course, they have to prioritize the urgent matters, and sometimes they don't have the time to wait for the research that within academia where things work a little bit slower. So we're here together. There is great representation from the corporate world. There is great representation from academia and from the United Nations in joint panels to see how we can align and make it work for real, maybe starting with small projects, maybe creating a framework, like to figure out what is the action plan and to come up with concrete recommendations that work for all of us to do AI for good in practice, okay? So that's all from my side. We can start with the first panel. I will introduce you all. I have to close the slide to open the Word document to be able to introduce you properly. So sorry about that. And welcome again, okay? all of you have such amazing bios and profiles that I had to kind of summarize a little bit. So the first panel, we have Virginia Dignum, professor of the Department of Computer Science at Umeå University, Sweden, where she leads the research of social and ethical artificial intelligence, member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence, fellow of the European Artificial Intelligence Association, EURI, member of the Commission of High-Level Expert Group on Artificial Intelligence, program chair of AMAS this year, and ethics chair of the Triple AI, among many other things, recognitions, and very valuable participations. We have Nitesh Chawla, founding director of the Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society at the University of Notre Dame, fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery, fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, AAAI, fellow of the Asia Pacific Artificial Intelligence Association, and fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineer. He's passionate about AI data science for the common good, and I can give faith of that, personal faith of that, among also many other responsibilities. Francesca Rossi, IBM Fellow and IBM AI Ethics Global Leader, based on the IBM Research Lab in New York, leads the AI research projects and co-chairs the IBM Ethics Board, president of the AAAI, among many other responsibilities. And Alex Diaz leads the AI for Social Good team at google.org, Google Philanthropic Arm. Through his role, he manages Google philanthropic efforts to empower nonprofits and has been named Forbes list of 30 under 30 for law and policy. And I'm sorry, Lynn, I don't have your, because this was an improvised, maybe you want to introduce yourself? Because Lane decided to, well, thank you so much for joining us today. We decided that she would be joining us yesterday. So would you like to, the members of the first panel? So I'm going to be asking some questions to the members of the panel, and afterwards, please, this is an open discussion. Feel free to, we're here to talk between all of us and figure out how to proceed. So just to start, maybe I will go in order you're sitting. Nitesh, what is your experience on, oh, now you cannot see this on the board, on the screen. You cannot see my screen on your screen. Ah. Yeah, okay. How can I? Close this. The other close the, yeah, close that window. Close that one, see? Window. It's not moving. Well, it's okay if they see this, actually, so let's leave it like that. Thank you. No, I think we disconnect. I don't do anything. No, it's okay, but it's okay, don't worry. Yeah, but you don't want people to see? No. I had like my document with your introductions that they didn't need to see. Yeah, but there's nobody connected on Zoom. Yeah. So we can go on. Okay, so let's proceed. Sorry about that, some technical problems. So Nitesh, what is your impression about what I was explaining from the University of Notre Dame and from your personal experience? What is the current landscape on AI for good? What are the obstacles and the things, the ways forward?
All right, this works now. Hey, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Georgina and Amir, for organizing this and getting us all together. So I think, as you said in your opening remarks, as academics, we sort of have a long tail effect as well, right? Things are moving at a much faster pace in the domain of AI. And there has to be a deliberation between that more, you know, academic pace of going through publications, getting them peer reviewed, getting them published, and as well as realizing impact. But however, I think one of my biggest pet peeves on AI for good is it's also being used in a very loose way. Generally, if you think about folks who may talk about building AI for social good or before this data science for social good, that generally meant I download a data set that describes a public interest problem. I will do a machine learning or a data science method on that data set and claim I have done data science or AI for social good. Now you ask them that what was the impact of that work, whether it led to a policy being impacted, led to one human life being impacted in a positive way. There is no way to measure. There's no metric from that. And so what does it take us to really have a realization for social good where we sort of think about how do we go from a paper that we have published which promises, if successful, this could have this impact? How do we take that last mile challenge? And I do not believe that we have sort of have a good handle on that last mile challenge to an action or to an impact. That I've this is the problem statement. It requires multiple disciplines to come together. It is not simply a domain of AI. That you take any sustainable development goal and if it has poverty or democracy or sustainability, it's not just a bunch of AI scholars or computer scientists hammering out data and doing some algorithms. It requires different disciplines to come together. And then we have to think about how do we take the translational journey from there on. And that, I believe, is where there's a significant gap in the community today on translation. And even from an academic side, significant gap in evaluating somebody's translational work, which may take 3 years to realize, and then that poor person may not get tenure or may not get a PhD because a paper hasn't happened. So we have to rethink incentives and structures in different ways.
Okay, thank you so much. Francesca, so what is your opinion on this from more like the industry? You are also a researcher, of course, from the research that is being done in IBM and more in the industry.
Yeah, so I agree with some of the things that Nitesh mentioned, and let me elaborate on some of those a little bit. So the first thing is that that I wanted to mention is that I think there has been some studies, for example, on even by Virginia a few years ago about how um, the research on AI has impacted the SDGs, right? And maybe there is the need, if it's not been done already, to do them again at this point after several years. But one of the things that I remember on that study, and also that I see in the papers that I read, and there are many, because the AI conferences include many of these papers, like the Ichkai track that you were co-chairing that started a few years ago, or the AI Ethics and Society conference that is all about, how to use AI for good purposes and in good, designed in a good way. One of the things that is easy to notice that each one of these efforts focuses on one specific SDG. So, for example, I use AI for health. I use AI for reducing poverty. I use AI for climate action, and so on. And we know that there is a lot of intersectionality between the SDGs. So maybe by developing what is needed, the kind of AI that is needed to address some of the SDGs, you get the other SDGs worse. So, for example, you develop AI that requires a lot of energy and a lot of water to be trained. So you are now impacting negatively the SDG 13 on the environment. So that intersectionality usually is not considered, but has to be taken into consideration where doing this AI for good to address the SDGs, because otherwise really you keep going up in one SDG and down in another one, or more than another one, and so on. So that is a issue that I think should be considered more when analyzing that work and also doing that work. I agree with Nitesh that the incentives part is very lacking. So even in the recent regulations for AI, like the European AI Act, for example, I didn't see much incentives for AI used to achieve or to get closer to the SDGs. So in fact, I'm from Italy, although I live in the States, but Italy recently has generated a new law proposal on AI that has actually incentives to use AI in the public administration, in the health domain, in the law domain, mainly to simplify, optimize, and help citizens to get better services, which is also part of some SDGs. So I think that all government should also help in putting together the right incentives, also with regulations. So AI regulation should not only be about trying to control AI and reduce the risks, which is also, of course, needed, but should also incentivize the right kind of AI and the right uses for AI. And then the last one is that what is missing, besides more work on the incentives, is also mentorship, education, ability of people to understand the challenges, such as learning, as you said, Nitesh, to work in a multidisciplinary way. People are used to work in silos. You are a computer scientist, you are a philosopher, you are an environmentalist, and so on. So AI for SDGs means that you need to work in a multidisciplinary way. And that means that you need to learn how to work with others that don't speak your language, don't reason like you are reasoning in their everyday job. So it requires some effort, at least at the beginning. So that is the kind of work that people and students need to be educated to do. So with Amir, for example, we are leading a project in the Global Partnership on AI that is all about helping AI teams all over the world understand how to scale this and implement this AI for good and responsible AI project. And what we have seen last year, for example, with teams from all over the world, is that really sometimes they don't even understand some of the obvious to us that we work on this area every day, dimensions of responsible AI or AI for good. So they collect data to do something good for health domain, but they don't understand that collecting data has to be done in the right way, so really needs a lot of co-working and co-mentoring, learning from these teams what the challenges are and what they're missing, and mentoring from our side. As the president of AAAI is the Worldwide Research Association of AI, and is trying to do a lot in educating and pushing researchers to really focus on these aspects and being more multidisciplinary than what they've been in the past. But I think there is still a lot to be done.
Thank you, Francesca. And Virginia, from your experience, and you know that I follow you in several conferences, what would be your recommendations? What would you expect all of us to do together?
Okay. Firstly, just to make it clear, I'm not speaking on the behalf of the United Nations or anything else. I tend to be controversial, and all the crazy things I will say, it's my own doing, and I'm not representing no one here, just to make it clear to start with. What can we do? We can start by understanding that the goals don't justify the means. We are too much looking at what can be the end result of AI for good, and not too much considering what are we doing as we develop the applications for good. The example I can give is, and I don't know if anyone has a throwaway water plastic bottle. I see one there. Can you just give me that bottle? Just for an example. We all know we shouldn't use this kind of things. Actually, there are much better options. But what we are doing with AI is, I have a great idea of bringing water to elderly homes because elderly people don't really drink enough, or to go save kids in Africa that are thirsty. Let me build AI in which I will reproduce 1 trillion of these things, and I will send it all to these old people in the elderly homes or the kids or whatever. Great, we are helping the kids and the elderly and whatever else. We are meeting the SDGs, I don't know the numbers, with my 1 trillion bottles of plastic. Sorry? SDG 6, thank you. Yeah, but it's still 1 trillion of these bottles of, not only 6. And by doing that, we are not taking care of doing things properly. We do need to say, great that you want to bring water to the elderly or the old people or whatever, but don't use throwaway plastic bottles. Make sure that the methods, the models, the techniques, the applications, the data is aligned with those kind of things that can be refilled. We are not enough asking that. All the people who are presenting here today and the other days and the previous years are just being valued. And it's important. I mean, the work they are doing is important, but they are being valued by the goals that they are trying to achieve and not so much by the better, what could they do better to achieve those goals in a way that is accountable, responsible, transparent, you know it all, fair, whatever you want, all these type of principles. So we can start small. We can start by asking this type of accountability and this kind of giving account of what they do from those that are developing AI for good applications. We should ask also for the ones that develop applications for whatever else that it's not necessarily the SDGs, but we need to start somewhere and we need to be accountable ourselves. In research, the same. We are accepting papers in all these conferences that we are doing based on the criteria of correctness of your algorithm, accuracy of your algorithm. No one is asking, great, you got your algorithm today, which is 0.5% better than your algorithm last year. How much compute do you use for that? Is it worth to use 30% more compute to get 0.5% more accuracy? How much have you done in terms of explainability? How much did that explainability cost? How much have you done in terms of the data sets that you use? Have you used again and again the same data sets that we use for research? Because those are the easy ones to find, or are we going somewhere? Have you considered doing it in a ways that don't really need a zillion data points and can be done in smaller data sets? So we have very simple things that we can do, but no one cares. None of us care. And we do need really to care for ourselves, for what we do, but also demanding the accountability from others and not accept that because I want to give water to all the elderly in the world, that I'm justified to use 1 trillion plastic bottles, which are going to dirty our oceans later on.
Thank you, Virginia. So it's interesting because each of you is talking about different aspects of it. And Lane, in your experience in OpenAI, what are the initiatives that you're undertaking to work towards AI for good?
Yeah, absolutely. So nice to get to be with all of you. Want to be super clear, not my water bottle.
OpenAI is enough water bottles.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Really appreciate the chance to get to have the conversation. I think a couple of things that I want to point to. I think one of the things that I think about a lot and really appreciate from Professor Dignum is really the concept that we all need to understand what is happening at a deeper level, and we need to be connecting the dots. And so this is something, an example I will give is I am a law school graduate and spoke with the dean of my law school. And there was a lot of focus on, what will the application of AI in law be? And that's an interesting and important question. But if you're actually training graduates, you actually want to be diving into the policy questions, which requires some foundational knowledge of how models are trained, what the ethical principles are around applications. You need that deeper layer in order to actually be asking the right questions in the right contexts. And that is not all, you won't learn all of that if you're focused only on the application. That said, I think for this conversation, incredibly important to be connecting, and Amir and I were just speaking about this, connecting these questions of safety, of risk, of the SDGs beginning to end to applied use cases in particular domains. And so I think to the point made earlier, if you are looking at, if the Italian government is looking at applying AI in health, there are both general questions that need to be asked around AI ethics, safety, and risk. And then there are domain-specific questions. And I think one of the things that's encouraging to me about this morning is it is a lot of people that we need. It is thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that we need engaging in research in these areas. Because the matters are complex and because the papers actually do quite help in thinking through these issues, both overall and at high levels and in terms of development and deployment in general, but also when we look at development for or deployment in particular domains where risks and where what a concept like human-centered means is different in the particular domain. And so I think that is some of the way when you look at our mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. And I actually spend a lot of time day to day unpacking that and really thinking through what does that mean in any different circumstance. And there's quite a bit in there. That's not just deploying AI in education, if that makes sense. It really is ensuring that beginning to end, artificial general intelligence, the thing that we're developing, benefits all of humanity. And that in itself is quite a challenge. I think in terms of specific domains and thinking, one of the other things that I do encourage, I think a little bit, this is a simplistic of way of thinking about it, but in terms of walk, crawl, run. So if you look at an area like law and policy, we know that there are excellent uses of AI right now around sort of general summarization, potentially drafting of legislation, getting to first drafts, brainstorming legislation around particular policy areas. And let me be more specific about that. You could ask right now, I would like to develop policy in this particular area. What would some ideas of legislation be? And you can actually fine tune or customize a tool that would help you to think about that and help you with drafting guided by a particular nation's legislation and the way that things are drafted and the corpus of law overall. And that is something that is interesting to many people. One of the reasons that's important, though, is that in finding what is useful and what is potentially risky, harmful, or not positive in that use case, you start to think through these questions of, okay, if I wanted to enable greater democratic engagement in the process of developing policy and legislation, how would I do that? What would the risks be? And ultimately, what does that mean, for example, for democratic inputs into our technology and the way, and I won't quite go there, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards with anyone. into the way that we actually think about guidance for our models. So all of which is to say that in each use case, and another way you could think about that is if you look at humanitarian aid, really thinking through what are the use cases now. If you could add the geospatial layer, how would you be thinking about that then? And then if you actually are thinking about agentic systems, where are the risks and benefits? Stepping into some of those use cases can be quite important in starting to do this research around how are we going to think about this as the systems progress and get more advanced. And I think education, health, any of these spaces, important to be thinking through, not just where are we now, but where do we want to be and what will we need in order to get there safely and to use the technology well.
Thank you so much, Lane. And now, Alex, what about the efforts that you're conducting in google.org? I'm pretty excited to find out the nice things you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for an amazing panel. I want to be clear, this is my water bottle. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Diaz. I work at google.org, Google's philanthropy. We are one of the largest funders of AI for social good. We've given over 200 million in cash since 2018 to nonprofits around the world, working to develop high impact AI applications. That does not include 100 million alone that we've given this year to lift up the capacity and do a lot of skilling initiatives for workers and students and teachers around the world. Fundamentally, what we try to do at the philanthropy is bridge research and practice. So we work really closely with research teams at Google, and then bring in nonprofits that are frontline and have they're most proximate to the problem, therefore they are most proximate to the solution. So we bring that input into the technology teams to help develop tools and research projects that are most beneficial for these nonprofits. But critically, what we've learned, and before I forget, we launched a research brief this week that has a lot more detail. I'm happy to give you the link afterwards. It's AI in Action, which talks about accelerating action and progress against the SDGs using artificial intelligence. That has a lot more detail than I could probably cover today in the panel. But what we've learned through the last 5 years I've been doing this work is that these solutions are only helpful when they are finely tuned to specific problems. So we always start with that problem set orientation. We talk to nonprofits and say, what are you trying to solve? And then from there, we figure out what solutions are available. Critically, some of those solutions are not technical. Secondly, some of those solutions that are technical do not need to be AI. And then for some problem domain areas, AI can be a really, really helpful accelerant tool. And what we've seen when we've surveyed our nonprofits is that they can reach their primary objectives, however to define them. This is across a bunch of domain areas in a third of the time at half the cost. In a world where we're so far behind to achieving the SDGs, that's the accelerant nature that we really need to catalyze and harness towards these specifically fine-tuned problems. Now, I'll give you two examples of going from problem to action that's been driving some significant impact on the ground. A year and a half ago, the Deputy Secretary General in a roundtable kind of looked at us and said, you guys are talking about AI, and I want to talk about data. I know we're behind on the SDGs, but I don't know why and I don't know where. Help us. Please work with the UN Statistics Department to help us figure out what is going on here. So I was like, cool, can you let me know who in UN Stats I should talk to? Fast forward to last UNGA, where we released a tool that's now publicly available. So these are all digital public goods that we try to create. These are open source systems. These are things that are really where market systems are not incentivized to catalyze this work. And that's where philanthropic risk capital can be really helpful to catalyze and build these solutions that can be used by many. So we launched something called the UN Data Commons for the SDGs. Now, this is a data commons infrastructure that helps interoperate publicly available data sets. What does that mean? That means that I can now, at the speed of my curiosity, learn, because of natural language front end, tell me about progress against SDG 1 in Argentina and Afghanistan and Indonesia. And it automatically pulls from the SDG database. Critically, it is a ring-fenced database of SDG data, but it can have World Bank data in there, census data, that's all standardized. And it'll pull out these insights that would have taken researchers hours, weeks, maybe months to clean up the data sets to find the insight that they can then leverage to drive a policy action. You can now do that in a matter of seconds. And I encourage you all, please look up UN Data Commons for the SDGs and have fun with it. Learn, but most importantly, put that stuff to action. Now, critically, that's now the backbone for the UN data system. WHO, if you hear later today, Steve McFeely is here to talk about how they just put their data into the commons because they want it to be used. They're sitting on so much data that is not being used that can really inform policy action that is so needed in this world. So I'll give you a second question, second prompt. We talked to a bunch of humanitarian aid organizations to try and figure out what do you need to help give aid to people as fast as possible. And there's a journey, so I'll take you on this journey. Post-disaster, what a lot of nonprofits will tell you is, I don't know where there have been damage. I don't know where to, I have limited resources and I need to get my limited resources into the people that need it most. So we could probably help with that. My colleague Kritika is here. We've been working together on a project called DISHA that's now housed at UN Global Pulse. And one of the use cases that's in there is a disaster damage detection model, where if you have access to a pre and post image of a building, of an area, and you can now pretty quickly and pretty easily find out which buildings have been damaged from hurricanes, from earthquakes. If you overlay that with other publicly available data sets like socioeconomic vulnerability, you have a really, really quick map of where are the most socioeconomically depressed areas that have been most hit by this particular disaster. That allows nonprofit organizations to get aid out in the first 24 hours as opposed to weeks to months, which is the standard process of going door to door to find out where aid has happened, where the aid is needed. But then we try to push the envelope a little bit further. There's teams at Google that have been really doing some cutting edge research on trying to improve the ability to forecast floods. So if you guys go around the main lobby area, there's a demo of the flood forecasting tool. That is awesome. But my nudge to that team is early warnings are nothing without early action. How do we get these research insights actually operationalized by frontline organizations on the ground? So some of these same organizations like Give Directly, which Alex Noir is now on your team, I love him, and the International Rescue Committee, and so many others said, hey, if we actually have more lead time and better granularity of where these floods are going to hit, we can provide aid in advance of the disaster. We can provide anticipatory cash. So we actually have a project that's been ongoing for a couple of years now. Another one's going to be going live in Nigeria this year, where with this ability to forecast floods with high granularity in up to 7 days, organizations can then give that cash to vulnerable families with a lot more lead time, and then you can test the utility of cash before a disaster hits. And critically, we're a philanthropy, right? No one's voting us into power to do this. So we are trying to test these interventions, build an evidence base, but ultimately it's going to be up to governments to have these conversations with policymakers and say, hey, we've learned that if you give cash before these disasters, you're going to have an overriding impact to save lives and livelihoods, right? If you give people 24 hours of lead time, you might save their lives. If you give them a week, you might be able to save a livelihood. And that's huge. But how do we then push that from being 1% of humanitarian aid to give me 2%, 5%? In a world where these compounding climate disasters are leading to compounding crises, more needs to be done in advance of these disasters. And now some of these artificial intelligence tools are allowing us that lead time to really be prepared, but most importantly, to also act.
Thank you so much, Alex. I totally agree with you. One of my conclusions is that we have to start by focusing on the problem, by asking ourselves what our goals are and working with nonprofits who are the people who are in the front line and who know what the emergency is and who know the reality of that specific situation. So many important points have been mentioned by all of you. Francesca has mentioned the need for education, and Nitesh, the need for incentives to go this last mile. Virginia on this need for accountability and how we achieve AI for good, doing the things the right way, and Lane also going on a deeper level to analyze domain-specific characteristics on do AI for good. So now, as a last question before we go into the next panel, because the next panels will have representatives from the United Nations and from academia to see how actually, so this is great that you explain all this, Alex, thank you for that, how we can actually focus on their needs from our research perspective. But maybe a last comment on how we can work together, because I still have the impression that we are in silos in a way. So how can academia and Google.org and IBM and work together on these problems that can be identified by the United Nations? Anybody? I mean,
I think one of the things that you will hear from us and just heard incredible stories of from Alex, I think that we do believe that NGOs are poised to really step in here. And, I think on our team, we look very carefully for NGOs that really have the technical capability and thoughtfulness to succeed in particular areas. I think that really the research community helping to inform some of those leading NGOs is a first step. That is a space where we will really lean in because we understand that both NGOs are closer to the problems, closer to the people often. They also just in this moment, quite honestly, are poised to take action in a way that is that can be quite important and powerful. So I think that combination of the research community and certain NGOs together with backing and support from teams like ours can create some really impactful collaborations.
From the perspective of the academia, we really also need to change mostly the incentives. Like you say yourself, people count how many papers you published at the end of the year. No one asks you how many NGOs you worked with.
Right.
And I think that that's a very important type of realization that also in academia and in the conferences and the venues where we share academic results and academic advances, we need to look at things from a different perspective. It's not just about how many papers we wrote, and probably no one reads those papers anyway, and they just stand there forever counting as written, but not as read. But really, what have you done in impact on maybe not only working with NGOs, but going outside of your field and going into the reality with the research that you do? We need to count those things.
Yeah, I'm not in academia now, but I've been in academia for more than 30 years, and I don't think they were counting how many papers people publish to give a promotion but they were counting how many they were counting how many papers you publish in that specific sector that you are working on. So those were a very, very monodisciplinary approach to evaluating. No, so how many papers you publish in computer science, but if you start publishing in some cross disciplines, then nobody knows who is going to count them, not the computer scientist evaluation committee, not the other evaluation committee. So you're not really, the incentive is not there to be working across disciplines and on specific sectors with people that work in that sector. So that is definitely has to be changed. There are already a lot of partnerships that are in place, but it's true that this I think about the partnership on AI, I think about the global partnership on AI, and so where companies work together with NGOs, with the civil society organization, with academia, with researchers, and so on. But it's true that many of those are they focus not on the outcome and on the specific sector of application, but they focus on the good AI part. So they focus, as Virginia says, so they focus not in AI for good, but on the good AI. So how you build AI, how you should design AI, the tools and the what you have to do to detect bias and mitigate it and this and that, but less about verticals in specific sectors. Some of them try to do that. I don't know. I think about the Partnership on AI recent guidelines around synthetic media development, so to avoid misinformation, deepfakes, and so on. That's a specific thing, vertical. But I think that that sector-based and application-based approach needs to be used more in those partnerships.
Thank you all. I think, first of all, I agree with everything that has been said, and it makes me wonder that as we think about research publications, we still are trapped in the world of sort our state of the art. Right? My algorithm is better than yours, and I have a table of results, and my results are in bold because, of course, they are because they are better than somebody else's. And whoop, and the reviewer sees that, and he goes, "Yes, this paper must be published." Uh, we still don't have, I heard the words of, the words accountability, explainability, computability, like what you're computing, how we measure impact, safety, risk, etc. There's no empirical metrics attached to these that we can sort of say that, as AMAS and AAA leaders here, perhaps we can sort of think about creating a new structure to incentivize authors to do this because you're correct. The amount of compute it may take, it's now is the one who has a bigger computer wins. It's not the impact, and what's the environmental impact of doing that. And then something else that was said was, how do we, I think, what are we trying to solve, and how do we bridge research and practice? And while these partnerships are amazing, but I also believe that a risk that we have faced is we have shifted accountabilities, right? A corporate partner says, "I will provide this." An academic institution says, "Okay, I will do research on this." Now, you not for profit go and implement. No one quite understands what is the entire sequence. How do we thread this sequence up? So I think that shifting of accountability is a challenge through these partnerships. And I'll share with you our own personal example. We started this project in Mexico with the Hospital Infantil Mexico Federico Gomez several years ago. And we went with this idea of that, how our data, the digital solution that we have with the AI is going to change the way delivery is going to happen. And but let me back up for a second. The reason we encountered it was serendipity. We encountered that challenge. So this hospital is the largest pediatric hospital, and it provides care for children with cancer. And it's in this street called El Doctores, one of the most dangerous streets of Mexico City. And you walk there and you see women and children sitting outside to be seen by the physicians. Then you ask, and because you are there now as an academic, you're observing, you ask, why are they sitting there? Because there is no room in the hospital. The hospital has finite number of beds. So where else can they go? Nowhere else to go. What if the child who's sitting outside is at a higher risk today than another one inside, like because the bed has been occupied? And then there's a risk of kidnapping and trafficking just by virtue of waiting outside on that street. At sunset, that place becomes really dangerous. There is no way of triaging risk for this hospital. And then you ask, okay, why there isn't any way? 2019, 2020, they still have paper-based files. So when we are thinking about, everything that we are talking about AI for impact digital solutions, here's this hospital armed with some amazingly good physicians trying to do the best they can. And every time a child arrives, they go to the basement, get the paper files out, peruse it, and that's how they sort of start the assessment of a child. There's no knowledge of what are the social challenges that family may be coming through, what commute that family may be coming through, what's the mental health acuity of the care provider for the child. So as we think about solving that problem, it's not simply that I have a digital application I will build. We will take all your data, we will triage risk, and lo and behold, problems will be solved. It doesn't work this way. So we had to get embedded. We had to do these deep ethnographic interviews with them. We had to bring together anthropologists and sociologists who understood these things, child psychologists, work. It took us many years, and then understand why the families are going to use this technology, why they're not going to use this technology. The algorithms were the easiest part. Digitizing was the easiest part. It was the expensive part, and no one was willing to fund it, right? Because it's in, the U.S. federal agencies wouldn't fund it. It's in a different country, unless you go to LMIC call for NIH. You have to go for foundations and things like that. So those were the easy. So we sort of, galvanized our things to do it. The most difficult part was why and how they should be using it, how the families can use it, how the physicians can use it. And as a result, now we have 400 families enrolled. This will be the longest study done now, where we have social determinants of health data, behavioral health data, clinical data, all put together to define risk, and these children and families are being observed, it would lead to a great paper. But 4 years later, now imagine a PhD student working on it, doesn't have a paper. Our incentive says, nah, you can't graduate. Somebody is on a tenure track position. 4 years, you haven't quite published, nah, you're not going to get tenured. So it leaves to folks like us who are tenured and already have these things to have the, it's again a luxury of a few. So in doing this AI for good, we have sort of also created an incentive system where only a few of us can do it because we don't have a risk to our individual careers. So we all have to collectively think about, and this is where I think these partnerships could be meaningful, impactful, where who can, sort of the translational journey continues, et cetera. And as academic leaders here, industry leaders here, how do we incorporate these amazing aspects into our publications as well?
Great, great intervention, all of you. Alex, I don't know, do you want to say something else?
Alex is going to say he's going to fund all this project in Mexico now.
Deal.
OpenAI. He will say, and IBM, we'll take the money.
I'll send you my email. No,
No, email with the wire instructions.
As Virginia said, I'm speaking on behalf of my stuff. No, just kidding. No, I just wanted to pull on that last thread. I mean, one of the hardest things is removing the ego from it. To the point of like my algorithm is better. Like there are enough algorithms. Some algorithms are good enough. And instead of duplicating, how do we collaborate? And how do we break down these silos and really come together, because it's going to need all of us. So I know we're running over time. So I'll leave it there. We love to collaborate. Please reach out. I'd love to figure out ways to work together.
That's great that you say that, because in the next panel we're going to go into like one level down kind of and talk with the representatives of the United Nations how we can actually help them, and with representatives from academia who are doing research to help on these topics on how to work together. And just as a closing of all this, you have identified key topics that we are already trying, that's what we are here, right? Some of these projects are not long-term enough because there is no funding enough. They are not sustainable in time. They are not replicable. So that's why they don't have a lot of impact. And also, I was recently talking to some colleagues, researchers, and they were saying to me, what's wrong with just contributing to the state of the art? What's wrong with just making science advance? Not everybody needs to have an impact on society, right? And that made me think, and I thought, yes, you're right. There's nothing wrong with that, actually. But we also need to have the means to be able to have that impact in society if we want to, right? And we don't really have them right now because, as you say, Nitesh, you need to be in a position, probably in a senior position, when you have the funds and your career is not at risk. So that's why, following on Alex's suggestion, we're here to figure out if there are other ways in which together we can work on that. So we have 5 minutes, 10 minutes break, and after we'll start the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to start the second panel now, and we will go into a bit more detail with representatives from academia and from the United Nations on what are the topics that we can tackle that as scientists we can go for. What are the obstacles? What is not working? What is working? And what to do, basically, okay? So I'm going to introduce the panel speakers. Nitin is professor of practice in the Department of Computer Science at Aalto University and leads the Crisis, Critical AI, and Crisis Interrogatives Research Group. He's working at the intersection of human-computer interaction, responsible AI, and participatory design, and examines the critical role of technology, civic agency, and social science in society and crisis contexts, among many other things. Caitlin Corrigan is the executive director for the Institute of Ethics and Artificial Intelligence at the Technology University of Munich. And Rajius is a research scientist. She's the principal data scientist at the United Nations Global Pulse in Asia Pacific. And she's the Secretary General's Innovation Lab, a hub for experimentation to support and advance the UN Charter. And Martin works for the United Nations on peace processes, national dialogues, and conflict prevention. He's an affiliated lecturer at the Center for Peace Mediation and the Institute for Conflict Management at the European University of Vienna. Okay, so thank you, four of you, for being here, for traveling from far away to be here today. Based on the explanation of the previous panel, how could we go into much more into the specifics? Like, first question, maybe the easiest is, what are the obstacles in research that you find, Nitin and Caitlin, that prevents you from having more impact in practice? Or what are the things that we should do differently?
I guess I'll use this. Intimate audience, so I think we can be frank with each other. I've been at Alta University for about 4 years as a professor of practice. Previous to that, I was at the New School in New York, and previously at the Media Lab at MIT. So we've all had quite a journey as academics. I've also run startups. I've also been in industry and had my own NGO in the West Bank and Gaza. So I've worn many different hats as a researcher, as a practitioner. I don't see myself purely as an academic because I work on problems that matter to me at a particular moment where there is a crisis, there is a condition that I want to transform. And if it leads to publications, great. If it leads to a practice-based impact, that matters to me. So I don't define myself as only a scholar. I define myself as a public intellectual. And as a public intellectual, you have to engage with civil society, with organizations, with government policy in the ways that we can. It's a very important role that we are given as public intellectuals, and we have to speak up when it matters, and we also have to really have action in what we do. Let me start with the positives. So I'm just quickly going to show you the work we do as a research group. So this is my research group at Alta University. It's called Crisis. The name is funny because when I moved to Alta in March of 2020, it was a pandemic, and of course we were having a crisis. And so the first project we began to do was very much around the pandemic as a crisis. This is my team. I'll just very quickly show you who they are because I can't take credit for the work we do. The credit goes to all of these amazing people who are sociologists, anthropologists, designers, human-computer interaction experts, linguists, machine learning engineers. There's a lawyer in my team. It's a really very cross-pollinating, interdisciplinary group. And we have obviously many, many other postdocs and academy fellows who work with us on many projects. Why do we have a team like this in a department of computer science? It's by design. Because the projects we do all engage with civil society. We never work on a project that's purely theoretical. Our group is very applied, but we use a lot of very rigorous methods and approaches in the work we do. So I'll just highlight a couple of key examples. The first project we had actually begun, as I was mentioning earlier, was on crisis narratives, understanding narratives of crisis that were happening during COVID. We had to develop this with the Finnish Center for Health and Education, Health and Welfare, which is something like the CDC in the US. And it was a 3-year collaboration. We got funding from the government, and we funded both our partner and us. I'm going to bring some of the kind of key approaches we've been using. We never do a project without providing funding to our partner. We don't just tell NGOs, hey, you've got plenty of time, come work with us so that we can publish some papers. That's fucked up. What we do is we help fund our partners with us and have equal stake in the process. And then we build a cross-disciplinary team. They had epidemiologists, social scientists on their side. We had anthropologists, we had designers, computational linguists working on our side. And we were mapping what was happening during the pandemic using social media analytics, but also doing interviews and with healthcare workers, journalists, and so on. And we've now published a dozen articles about this work, but we've also actually impacted the policies of THL in terms of vaccine hesitancy and improving the way they work with marginalized communities in the neighborhoods. Another most recent project that we've gotten 6 years of funding for, and again, it's a consortium of universities, Aalto, Helsinki, and Tampere, and we also funded our partner, the city of Espoo, to hire staff to work with us on the project, and we're trying to develop trustworthy and inclusive AI systems that work in conjunction with human expertise to provide better digital support and help to migrants who are coming to Finland. We have the highest unemployment rate of women in Finland, in the OECD, among the Nordics. Shocking, because I'm in a Nordic country. I'm in sort of like what I consider the sort of utopian bubble. But migrant women who come here have a very hard time getting into the labor force. The city of Espoo discussed this with me, and we said, let's prepare a project where we can deal with this. So we have a very nice collaboration where we're looking at these issues using social science methods, using design research, and then we're actually building conversational AI tools that will hopefully help us mediate this. So we actually observe how counselors work with migrants. We're figuring out, can we have AI-based systems provide additional expertise as they're having a conversation, listening into the conversation with consent, and then bringing expertise from other counselors in real time to help them provide answers in a much more effective and efficient way. A paper we wrote about that just got accepted at CSCW, and it's fantastic. So we're getting publications out. We're also doing actual impact work, helping them shape policies and practices. And there's actually a policy element to this project where we have a team that's looking at the legal policy implications of the new government regulations. We have a far-right government in Finland that is very anti-migrant, and we're pushing back hard against them. I've been to protests every other week since this government was elected. And as an academic, I've spoken very, very loudly in the news media and in public policy forums about the issues that we should be dealing with. So I'll kind of pause with the projects I want to show you, but there's so many of these dealing with disinformation, dealing with how we build better practices with public sector. So we exclusively work with public sector, at least in Finland. And in the long term, we'd like to work with Global South organizations. I was in South Africa. The problem in now getting to the obstacles here are essentially what was mentioned earlier by Nitesh, incentive structures. There are very few or no incentives for us to be doing this kind of work. We're doing this because we care, because I'd rather be doing this as an academic than anything else. So it matters to me that I build a research group that I'm priming for the next generation of socially engaged practitioners. Yes, indeed, we need to. So I've worked, when I was at the new school, I've actually tried to work with the committee to allow tenure track reviews to have a social impact criteria built into it. It took us years to get that approved. There's no such thing at Aalto University. So these are real challenges that we as academics have to confront, and they're just part of the many things that we have to do. Maybe I'll end with one last thing to say. I have a real allergy to the word AI and to the word good. We don't use the word AI in my group very widely. We use algorithmic systems. We use big data systems. We talk about automated decision-making because we've also done research on how AI gets fetishized and how the metaphors we use around AI can be very problematic. I also have a problem with doing good because it's very subjective and it can be very superficial and can be used for whitewashing social justice issues. So in our group, we actually take a much more critical stance on all of these issues. And an area that I'm very, very concerned about right now is the use of AI in war and human rights violations. What's happening in Gaza, the genocide that's happening in Gaza right now, as we speak, is powered by AI systems we've all been developing that Google, Microsoft, and other companies right here have been funding and supporting. And there's been a huge amount of protests about that within these companies, but we as academics can't be quiet. We have to speak up and talk about how our own AI-based research is being used in human rights violations and promoting genocide. So I think we have a much bigger responsibility that goes beyond good to actually mediating harms and human rights violations.
Thank you, Nitin. So I think you tackled 3 topics that are kind of key. First of all is the personal commitment, right? Because since there are no incentives, as researchers, we're pursuing these goals because we believe in these goals, because it's something we really want to do, even if we go against the tide, against the system, right, sometimes. And also the need to find funding for some of these projects, because we work with nonprofits and we look for funding for our research and for the nonprofit. So we have a double responsibility. And so defining these goals, right? So I think that's key. So Caitlin, in your experience in the Technology University of Munich, how do you tackle all these topics?
Yeah, so I think, echoing a lot of what Nitin just said, our institute also, the Institute for Ethics and AI, is also purposefully very applied and very interdisciplinary, and both those things can present major problems in university settings. On the one side is funding, kind of the bringing in of money so that we can work on these problems that we all care about, but often don't have the capacity to do or the incentives to do. And I mean, one of the major problems is a lot of funding agencies or foundations or whatever preach that they love interdisciplinary work, but in practice, this is very hard to communicate. For instance, often with grants, you have to pick which committee it should go to. Should it go to the political science committee or the computer science committee? And there's always going to be someone on there that says, well, this is a political science project. Why did they send it here? Or this is a, and the other way around. And so even just that struggle to kind of get in the door and make your case can be really hard. On the other side, that we're very applied, and that a lot of the work we're going to talk about here in academia, the academic work here is very applied, is actually going out of the university, right? So it's not actually very easy at the university to do short-term projects with external stakeholders such as nonprofits or private companies. The university system, at least in Germany, I can't speak for everywhere, is just not so set up for that. It's very long-term. It's hard to kind of do these financial exchanges. So this kind of rapid response work becomes kind of difficult at that level. And I think in terms of kind of the obstacles, I mean, the question of the session, kind of the obstacles faced by nonprofits trying to integrate this research is also related to both of those, in that we can't do these rapid response projects, but also on the financial side, kind of going back to what Virginia was saying, in this good AI for good, that often that's kind of the first thing to go or to be cut from the budget, kind of these kind of means and how we're going to deal with them. So some of the issues we identified, we just recently, earlier this year, put out a research brief on the ethical considerations for AI use in human security. So this covers a lot of these humanitarian issues. And, a lot of these nonprofits are under capacity to begin with, and then under capacity in their IT department. And then when you talk about things like data ethics or standardizing how data is used, thinking about real consent of where data is used. I mean, you're talking about vulnerable populations. For instance, if you're gathering data from refugee camps, if you make data collection a stipulation of entering a refugee camp, is that really consent? So they're dealing with a lot of very dynamic issues that probably aren't considered in other sectors. And if the funding's just there to build the algorithm or whatever, often, these other questions become kind of on the margins or left behind. So kind of incentivizing this type of AI for good AI for good funding is also key.
Yeah, you tackle also such good topics, because sometimes getting the data is even more difficult than getting the actual funding, right? Because of obvious reasons. And also the interdisciplinarity is a big topic, right? And there should be incentives for that, because obviously we cannot be totally proficient in all the topics. There should be some incentives for generalists, of people who are bridging between disciplines to focus on these goals, right? And so now Martin and Rajus, maybe we start with Martin. UN, guys, how can we help you? And we know that we go at different speeds, right? Academia, we are much slower. We're kind of like a snail or a turtle sometimes. And we know that you have real urgent topics. How can we make this work? Any ideas?
I mean, to start with, that UN is celebrating 80 years next year, and we're an awfully slow tanker. Things take a lifetime to change. And I wanted to start with an anecdote. Over 10 years ago, I started working with the UN in the Middle East. Problems are still unsolved there, and we were asking for satellite images to get a clear idea about a certain situation. Not going to reveal that, obviously, as we are partly on record here. And we got satellite images outdated, 3 years old. How can you act on that? And the answer was, beggars can't choose. Beggars shouldn't choose. Take what you get. And we haven't talked with, somebody just mentioned whitewashing. There's some conversation about greenwashing when it comes to environmental issues, but also blue washing, right? Like the amount of times, and I just spoke about this in the break with another colleague here, we see SDGs appearing own maybe plastic bottles of water, which I think, if you think about it, is better to have it than not to have it, right? And we've seen definitely an increase of conversations on data for good, AI for good, technology for good, which is rather recent. And I think this forum is celebrating 7 or 8 years. I'm not sure about it, and the fact that this mechanism exists where we can come together is an achievement, right? Now, let me point out some of the pain points before I come to the solutions, right? One pain point is certainly that the problems we bring to academia are not big enough, right? Every time we speak with the MITs, Harvards, Columbia's, what name you name it, HBKU, KAIS, you name the university in the world, they tell us that the problems we are trying to fix are actually not big enough, academically speaking, right? There could be certain arrogance. That's something you mentioned yesterday, Georgina, to me in the evening, that there's, some academic crowd that believes, they're there for higher purposes.
That was a private.
That was a private conversation. Okay, then somebody else called Georgina said that to me. Totally mistaken. But I've experienced that as well. That the answer is like, look, Martin, this problem you're bringing us is too small. This is something a first-year PhD student could solve. And I'm like, give me that first-year PhD student. And then the professors are saying, well, actually, that student should solve issues for me, to either get tenured or, be chosen for higher spheres work. So that's one challenge. And now let's look at the private sector, and we are just representing the UN and academia here, but there are a lot of the challenges we face with the good ones that help us in many regards is maintenance, right? Once the photo op is done, once the ribbon is cut, who's going to cover the maintenance cost? And most of the projects are supposed to be for a longer period than a grant lasts, like a year or 2 or 3. They're there for a perpetuity, and one of the solutions is open source, good documentation, and we often lack that. And I would ask all of us who have benefited from AI for good projects, how well documented are those? How transparent are those processes of how the projects are selected? How well do we monitor the impact, of those projects? Have they really delivered on what they promised? So those are certainly challenges that we face. Now to the solutions. One thing that we've seen working very well, and I'm just want to point out some of our partners that we've worked with for years now, HBKU and Qatar Computing Research Institute for 6 years, that have provided spaces for us, right, as an international organization to bring together problem owners, so that's us on the UN side, with solution providers, so academia, right, make time available for that. And this kind of convening has been enormously helpful and free of charge. And I know many universities charge even for using the room for an hour at their venue. So like providing that space and also that human talent to have those conversations has been immensely helpful to bring, again, problem owners and solution providers together. That I would love to see more of that. We have too little of that. That's number one. And the second part, and that's with regard to the private sector, and we've been more successful with the medium and smaller size companies than the big ones, obviously, because they have when you're closer to the CEOs, the investors, and we have representatives here like closer to the food chain, so to say, the capacity is more made available. We've seen this working out very well when we understand that, and the UN is a conundrum here, right? Because we have procurement mechanisms. We can't just slap kind of a logo on a product, right? It would be misunderstood, talking about ethics here as hidden advertisement, right? But where we co-develop then solutions that stay in the public domain, right? That are publicly available for everybody. Again, open source is one element to that. I know there's no open source in general. Somebody has to pay for the compute, somebody has to store it, and but at least there's open documentation and there can be a replicability of those efforts. And I've seen that working out very well. So I would love to see that more on the AI for good side, where those solutions are on GitHub or any other platform, right? Made available to be tested, to be challenged and replicated elsewhere. Yeah, thanks again for having us and bringing us together.
Thank you so much, Martin. I mean, you made a comment that is very interesting to me, that universities find the problems of the UN not big enough. For me, that's incredible to believe. And I think that probably there is a need for like at the lower level connection, because if you could connect those challenges with specific research groups, not high level leaders at the university, probably you would find very good synergies and ways to work together. And actually, I can already propose to you that as part of a co-chair of ICHCAI and other conferences in AI, we could probably have those challenges part of the call for papers, because the problem that we have now is the call for papers is too broad, like talking about do something for the SDGs. People don't know, you know what I mean? The ideas are too vague. But if we could tackle more specific problems, so here there is a good area to start, like making things work a little bit better, I think. So Rajus, from your experience, what can we do? I mean,
Yeah, thank you for having me here. First of all, even though I'm from the UN, but yes, as you mentioned, that I will share my experience. So this is not like the UN how to do things actually. Um, since I stepped out of the academia a couple of years ago and fit into my new positions in the intersection between innovation, policy, development, and humanitarian sector, I immediately see the disconnection between the state of the arts, the academia, and whatever application in the field where policymakers making decisions based on whatever available in the ground. So let me explain or shape my experience based on the innovation life cycle. So in innovation life cycle, we have three major components. One is what we call as the proof of concept. This is what the academics working at. You show the state of the art. We also, as an applied researcher, I also try to do or apply the state of the art from the academics to certain context and then share the insights with the paper, go to the conference. So that's the output. But then if we want to share the insights to the government, to the policymakers, to the other NGOs, development agencies, we usually build the prototype. So this is the phase of prototyping, where now I start to work with like engineers, for instance, full stack engineers, data engineers, those people who will build the fancy, flashy dashboard so that when people, the non-academics or the non-expert or the non-technical audience see the dashboard, they can see the insights in a convenient way according to us, but not according to them. That's the first phase of innovation. The second phase is actually adoption. Now, most of our innovation projects actually stop in the first phase. We try to find out why. And then after that, we realized that we don't include human elements into our platform, actually. So that's why we started to do the mixed methods, what we call this mixed method approach, but maybe you call them interdisciplinary approach. So we have another team that's specifically looking at the user needs, user capacity, looking at the ecosystem, like the regulation, the custodianship, the political economy, to make it work so that it can move, our prototypes can move from just the prototype into adoption. That's the second part. And the third component is scaling up. So after one organization is willing to adopt, invest their resources, and then use our solution, and then if we want to make it replicable to other contexts, to other regions, for instance, that's the scaling phase. So it's actually quite rare to have some of our innovative solutions to go from the prototyping to the adoption. And it's very, very rare actually from adoption to scale up. So we only have right now with the scaling up in mind is the DISHA project, the one that Alex mentioned for the damage assessment, socioeconomic mapping. That project is designed with a scaling up in mind. So it's increasingly difficult actually to go from one phase to the next phase. So now let me get back into some of the points that have been raised during the first panel and also this panel. I have mentioned about this interdisciplinary approach, which has been which we used. Like we specifically use or always try to integrate what we call as service design into when we build our platform, and that's because we do the user research since the beginning, because we have learned from our experience with some other prototypes that if we don't do the user research, we don't try to map their needs, and then we just left being what we have is being left abandoned or being shelved. But if we understand their needs and also assess their technical capacity, we will understand that what needs to be done for them to be able to adopt our solution. Now, there are two things here. The first one is on the data, getting the data. So getting access to data is a real challenge for us, specifically because we work with non-conventional data like the big data. We are not the data provider. We are not the data owner. So we have to talk to the private sector and see if they are willing to talk about this, like, are you willing to share your data because you want to see or unlock the potential for the social impact, for instance. And it's not always successful. Actually, if we are successful to get the data in the end, it will take 1 to 3 years to actually finalize the agreement. Yeah, and so we also have to talk to the government because some of the non-conventional data sits with the government, and it's another challenge as well. And the challenge is increasing if we want to combine those data. So usually innovation project, you wouldn't expect to see the impact in a short term. It has to be in a longer term. And this is not something that we typically find if we want to apply for the grant as well. So usually this is also a challenge for us if we want to have like longer term project to get funded for our innovation. The second challenge, apart from the access to the data, is on the technical capacity gap between our novel solutions and the user. So we have, as a technical person, I want to apply whatever the academics produce, like the most sophisticated model in our platform and then produce the insights. But what happened on the ground is that or build a very fancy platform, but when we deliver the solution and it's not working for the users because we see that there is a technical capacity gap between our novel solutions and what they can provide in terms of infrastructure and also the resources, like the human resources, for instance. So for the solutions, we are still working on that actually, but for the data, the getting access to the data, we are exploring different modalities. Like, are you willing to be like data philanthropist? How about data value partnership or shared value partnership or what? So in this show, for instance, we try to build a single data agreement model so that the humanitarian organizations don't have to go into the bilateral agreement with the data providers like the private sectors, because it's gonna be really hard for them to do that. So they just need to have agreement with us. We will do the agreement for them in one single model. So that's one modality, but we are exploring other opportunities as well. And for the capacity gap, technical capacity gap, this is not only about the infrastructure or the human resources. This is also related to the interdisciplinary approach that some has mentioned, but in my experience, when I talk, I have to talk to a diverse audience. I can talk to the academics, I can talk to the policymakers, but I have to use different languages, and I have to talk to our users, like the ordinary people, and it's a different language. So probably this is something that researchers have to keep in mind if you want to also apply your work to the intended specific audience, how to communicate with them in their language so that they can understand. Maybe I stop here.
Thank you so much. So much valuable information. Now, I was making here a diagram about the AI for good value chain, kind of, because in the last session today, we're going to have persons from the YPO, the Young Persons Organization, to help us figure out how we can make our proposals kind of sustainable and attractive for funding, so that we can actually make this real. We can make our proposal for real, right? And I was noting here that, of course, we were focusing on the panel before a lot on how to work with the nonprofits, right? How to work with the UN, how to focus on the real problems, right? And how to define the goals of our research. So that would be the first step. Then we do the academic research contributing to science, kind of like that. That's the way we say it. But then I realized now, listening to you, Rajus, that there is, of course, the whole other like end of the chain, right? Which is how to translate it into products. Maybe we have to generate startups, spin-offs, and there are different formulas for that because we want that to become real, and it's not enough by doing the research, right? And so any final comments of all of you, because this is a very good setting of afterwards seeing how to make this for real, right? Together. Caitlin.
Just to build off of that really quick, that I don't think a chain is necessarily the right, I don't know what the formation would be, but like to only think about that once the academic product is built would be a problem, right? Like these kind of ethical, good AI for good type questions need to be done before, you know, the tool's even built, to think about these questions of how do we deal with vulnerable populations? How do we deal with dual use and the privacy and safety implications it could use? Like that's not something that we should hand off and then say, you guys figure out to do. That has to go into the entire planning of whatever the tool is. So maybe more of a circle or a network or something rather than a chain would be the right.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with, yeah, this happens a lot, right? Like we do research and then afterwards, how do we make this ethical? No, it has to be ethical by design, right?
I also challenge the model of doing things in service of organizations. I really think we should think of it as a partnership where we are co-learning together. We have common objectives that we're working towards. And we from the ground up, begin the project, conceptualize it together, and then see metrics of evaluation, whether academic metrics or societal metrics together. And we all take responsibility for what comes out, including the engagement of our students as co-collaborators, including involving vulnerable communities and building good ethical norms to support them. So every project I've done in the last 4 years, at least at Alto, we've had this kind of partnership model that goes from, goes in a very long horizon. So I want us to be cautious of having this hubris as academics, as if we are the experts and we know everything, and you should come to us at Harvard or wherever at MIT and ask our expertise. I think that's bullshit. We really don't know very much outside of our, because I've spent time on the ground in so many places, I've had that reality check. We have to learn. So I use the notion of transdisciplinary research. And what transdisciplinary research is all about is about building knowledges that you don't have, explicitly going outside of your well-defined fields and collaboratively developing knowledges. And these knowledges can come from indigenous communities, from migrants, from civil society actors. And this collaborative knowledge development is a very challenging. And so one of the projects we're trying to develop is a living lab. Rather than saying, come participate in our academic project and we'll give you a little compensation, or we're building living labs where we can actually work together with vulnerable communities, where they have agency, political agency, they can challenge our assumptions. And we use participatory action research, PAR, as an approach where we actually have to align our action goals with the communities we affect. So it requires a very different orientation. I feel like there's a very naive, superficial approach towards AI for good that's even happening at this conference. And we have to really challenge that and really go back to the basics about what are we really trying to do as partners in these contexts. So this is something I'm very, very critical about.
It's great. Probably this will lead to more like deeper conversations between all of us to figure out what would be the best model and going much deeper. I agree. I totally agree with you. And there is a contribution from the audience, right?
Yeah.
Just a simple anecdote from
Please.
Silicon Valley. My name is Gregory Tutton. I'm in the diplomatic corps for the Order of Malta at the UN, but I'd come originally from Silicon Valley. So my only comment to make in follow-up here on startups, or how does academia work with startups, or how do you transition from thinking into doing? One of the problems is most of the companies upstairs, Apple, Google, Facebook, now Meta, or some of the others, Microsoft certainly, the founders didn't finish their undergraduate degrees, which isn't a provocative statement. I'm not against academia. I finished mine. But do the leading founders actually finish academia such that what you're talking about in terms of research could actually become actionable? So that's not maybe a helpful comment, but then there's even, Peter Thiel is still encouraging a lot of young people not to do their degrees. Peter is giving, 100,000 to promising students to not be students and just start things. So I'm happy to help in any way we can to further the engagement with academia. My family has founded or chaired or founded endowments for different academic chairs at different universities over the last decades. But how does academia engage with tech? There needs to be a bigger discussion about the young people who can start doing tech because they do a lot of GitHub at night and then they just launch something. And then there's a disconnect here with what's happening. And we really need to make that connection better. So that's not criticism. I like universities. But some people didn't graduate from them, Bill Gates or
If I can answer that. Well, go ahead, Frank.
Hi, I'm Frank Dignum. I'm at Umeå University till the end of this week, next week in pre-university in Amsterdam. I was actually wanting to make a remark already to the first panel about this Google actually giving a lot of money for education. And we always think we have to educate people in Africa and poor countries and all that. But I think that actually we should educate those people from the big tech companies that didn't finish their education because it shows off.
Yeah.
I thought yesterday Sam Altman, really incredible. So many mistakes he makes, so little wise of the world. He should get more education about how to actually put a product in the market in a responsible way. But he is a tech guy, he has no ID. And most of the people from OpenAI, they have no ID. So we should educate those big tech company people in ways to be better. And I think having a lot of them not having finished their education actually shows off all the time in this kind of things. And I think it's really terrible.
Thank you, Frank. That was exactly the comment I wanted to make, he's more eloquent on that. I think that is our job as academics, partly, is that we're not just educating the next generation of engineers to do the work of tech companies. We should be educating a next generation of thinkers who are very, very critical. What's happened in US campuses in just the last few months has inspired me so much, because these young people are putting their degrees and lives on the line to say we believe in human rights. And the adults in the room, the faculty, very few of them have spoken up. So they're not just, they're aware that they're not just going to come out just to get jobs in big tech. They want to come out to be citizens of the world, to make a difference. And this is what makes lobbying organizations and governments very, very nervous, because they know that the next generation of students have a social justice agenda. And we're missing out on that. So I don't just want my students to go work and make lots of money. I hope they survive and they'll do fine, but I want them to actually go work with NGOs, go work in human rights contexts. I want them to be policymakers. If they don't have those skills and they don't think critically, I've failed. So part of my job is doing that. Part of my job is also working with startups. I've run startups. I've been in that space. I know the challenges and opportunities there. Part of my job is also to work with organizations to think about how can we build lateral horizontal learning with them. And if OpenAI wants to work with us, we're going to have a very, very critical approach to how we can help them think about these things differently. So I'm not giving up on startups, but I think what I'm inspired by are young people today who are challenging us in really incredible ways. So, yes.
I'm in trouble. So the reason why a lot of the US campus students are protesting actually fundamentally relates to today's workshop here. If you can make the connection between the ways in which the Gaza war is being prosecuted through AI. So those would be it's a controversial comment. It's also
not controversial.
Accurate, but Lavender and Gospel and Where's Daddy? I mean, those fundamental autonomous systems also go right to the heart of the US legislative policy, because Section 230, please talk to Isabel later, she did her LLM on this issue.
Really?
Section 230 means, and she's at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we're going to be talking about this at the 56th session of human rights that starts next month, but there's no liability. The drone killed so-and-so, and the drone was designed not only to kill so-and-so, but to maximize the damage.
Yeah.
But that's not my fault if I'm in the military complex or if I'm in the government. The drone killed it, and then we got the drone, and that's it. So there's no liability, there's no responsibility, and yet AI sits at the middle, at the center of all of it. So the students are actually protesting ultimately a cultural anthropological question, which is what is human, what is humankind, and how can we be kind to other humans while we're building autonomous systems that actually make autonomous decisions to wipe out the humans that aren't apparently human.
The truth is their courses are not preparing them to do this. No. And our courses are failing in actually bringing up human rights concerns effectively, but they have figured out these issues on their own, and that's extraordinary. So we have to build on that to really build that kind of public awareness, critical awareness in what we teach and in how we work with organizations.
Okay, so we're running out of time. This is a super interesting conversation, and we totally agree that critical thinking is something that academia definitely needs to bring on the table. I would maybe ask for 2 brief contributions. Virginia, and then there is a lady there, maybe 2, like if you can, like 10 seconds or something.
Just on the narrative of building autonomous systems. Those systems are not autonomous. By the narrative of keeping calling them autonomous, we are justifying the fact that we are using these systems. Yeah. So we need really to stop the narrative of calling them autonomous.
Okay.
And maybe just quick tag on is that also implies you're not responsible, right? It's autonomous, right? You don't have liability. So two quick comments. Talking about, I don't think you should blame yourself if students are graduating without having the right ethical mindset. I think there's an intrinsic motivation issue. I mean, I remember my computer science undergrad days, and we're laser focused on finishing our work, and of course, not everyone decided to graduate. And so I think there's an intrinsic motivation aspect that needs to be addressed. It's not just, maybe it has to be a required course. I don't know, again, if that's going to be enough, but that's one aspect. So as well as the critical thinking. The other, talking about this issue, we've had these issues for a long time. This is the AI has brought this to the fore. So anyone here from the UK, I think, knows this, and it just was broadcast in the US. If you've heard of this show, Bates versus the Post Office in the UK, the Horizon system, which was the system where they, I guess, booked all their transactions in the post office. These were all run by independent sub postmasters. They were accused of fraud, and it was a system that was miscounting the money, and apparently thousands of pounds were lost. People went bankrupt, went to prison, some even committed suicide, and the Postal Service refused to accept it. They said the system was perfect. Fujitsu, who built the software, also didn't accept any responsibility. The tech support lines were all saying no one else was having this problem, when actually there were hundreds of other postmasters having this problem. And this is just a basic database system, right? This is not the sexy AI that we're having, that we have now. So we have had these issues for quite a while, and at least it's coming to the fore because of the questions coming from AI.
Thanks. I did have a question and a comment. My comment, just to introduce myself. So I'm at IOM, International Organization for Migration. I'm the privacy focal point there. We don't have a DPO yet, so I sit in legal. I feel like I have to give you my background in order to understand where I'm coming from. It's not that I'm anti-technology. I like technology as much as the next person, but I've been working in privacy in the humanitarian sector for 5 years now, and I definitely see that there is pressure, tangible pressure on the humanitarian sector, on international organizations, on NGOs to use technology for the sake of using technology. And everything we do should be via the humanitarian principles, the do no harm approach. It needs to be beneficiary focused. And that's part, we have to constantly revisit our mandate, but that pressure, sometimes as a privacy focal point, I feel like I can't compete with it. It's this, but that's the direction everything's going. And I'm not saying everyone does this, but it's there and it's tangible.
that was just my first general comment, and I don't know if others in the UN can speak to that, but I do recognize I am coming from this legal compliance privacy place. I had one minor other comment for Caitlin, which is you mentioned consent of beneficiaries to, for example, receive assistance and access to refugee camps, for example. I think that basically in the 5 years I've worked in this field, I've advised colleagues to use consent. I can count on one hand how many times as a legal basis, because in the humanitarian sector, there's generally a consensus amongst DPOs and legal advisors that consent is not a viable basis. You know, if you don't get food and humanitarian assistance because you don't consent, that's not freely given consent. So that's kind of a general understanding, at least, and reflected in data protection policies as well. My question was for Nitin. You mentioned that within your team, you actually have someone or maybe multiple people from legal, and I love that because we're quite siloed in the UN, and you know, because a lot of things come to us and they, you know, they're emergencies and they require immediate attention. Privacy and like legal compliance kind of is an afterthought, and it has to be really integrated into SOPs, integrated into the process, so that when you have to respond quickly, it's already there. So I'm wondering from you, do they also look at privacy and data ethics, or are they just looking at, I think you mentioned like the laws that were affecting migrants?
I'll answer very, very quickly. My legal scholar looks at much broader questions. And of course, she's involved in many of these things. But actually, we have a very robust legal expertise within Aalto University that we consult with whenever we start a new project, whenever we sign new contracts and agreements, whenever we do a new research informed consent process. We have very robust legal expertise that Aalto University provides. And I urge all of you to use your university's legal teams in all of this, even if you can't hire your own legal expert. So it's very important. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. We're gonna have like 5 minutes break maximum because we're late. We can continue discussing afterwards on actually how we can, in fact, the purpose of the workshop is how we can work together to achieve the SDGs. Also, let's all keep that in mind because it's important, okay? Okay, so see you in 5 minutes.
Hey, awesome. What's your name? You were, yes.
I think it was in my nature. I'm gonna go get a coffee because I really need it.
Yes, you have to spend time together, so. You're going to be just to the electricity. Oh, to electricity. Oh, in fact, I mean, I could use my laptop because it'll just power back. But if somebody is connected to electricity already, then that wouldn't be a problem, right? Yeah, sometimes they have. Yeah, but probably not then. I'll find it. Punch you. I think you're on the same. Oh, you're on the same plan. Yes. Yeah. I'll try to find something. Do you know what station that guy is from? Yeah. But I was wondering what diplomatic policy we're doing in Malta. Or is he from Malta? Or is he? I think. I'll ask. Yeah, because he had some interesting stuff to say. And I connect these questions. What I Here's my digital.
Yeah. We just listened to this video. Are you speaking anymore?
Sections with Apple cigarettes. Phone company, national
Violence or that
it's very good. Okay, why did you kill that? It's in Facebook.
I love that. Like, it's huge.
These syllables, things. Yeah, I was like, what is this? So, yeah. Yeah. So, this is where. Oh, we have to try to get. Yeah, I feel really guilty when I'm not picking up on it. I mean, because I have to wait like 2 hours. It's so frustrating to me, like, it goes down to wait. Very precarious short-term contract.
My wife agrees. Have your own advocacy freedom.
I was saying, thought or stand up, close to I don't know if you have your if you speak up on this. This is your right. Oh my God, this is fantastic connection.
And I got people in I think Colombia, but you demonstrate, and then 5 years funding is over. If you're all looking at this is not right. Then the progress is but in a legal way, they carry decided I would like be digested all this work the money we afford, the outcomes.
That was always about you gave $2 million for your basket. Yeah. And where should we sound? Oh, yeah, because I'm not that's your laptop. Right. And at some point, the government, do you have any interest? No. Zero charge.
Charge it in my
I know. No, you have a USB. No, because she was going to connect it to USB on the other side, right?
Oh, was it meant? Yeah, I don't know. So it's like or here.
Wait, I think it's. There you go.
Okay, now let me check if I have it.
Are you? Oh, okay, cool. IBM. Where are you based?
Normally out of San Jose, California, but currently in the Germany. So
this year. A lot of people in Germany, or from I guess a big country next door. Yeah. But a lot of people from Germany who are not German. But that's got a big EU. So I mean, not you, but other people, right? Yeah.
There's lots of internationally. Were you in the previous panel?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't sitting in the panel.
No. So she is the
patron. Yeah. Yeah. So I've met her before.
Yeah.
I want to win the US issue from.
We didn't get that far.
Okay. We've exchanged a lot of emails before it's the first time we met, but she knows my colleagues as well. To be part of her network. Very mindful. The president's project is good.
San Jose. California. But I'm currently in Germany.
Right.
We will continue. Okay, everybody. I see that you're having great conversations, and that's wonderful because that's what we're here for. But also, we have, unfortunately, an agenda, and we don't want to be late because the final panel speakers also have to catch flights, and there is a whole thing. So if the next panel speakers could please come to the stage. And everybody else could take a seat, please. Oh, there's somebody here or nobody here? Nobody here, probably. Yeah, no, Aparna cannot come. She's sick. Thank you. Right. So I think that this is pretty helpful. The final of the workshop, we should kind of figure out what the next steps are for us to be able to kind of break the silos and start working together, UN, private industry, and academia, so that we can follow up afterwards. We don't want this to be just, not just, but we don't want just to talk. We want to define some next steps. So let me introduce the next panel speakers. Nuno Moniz is Associate Research Professor at the Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the Director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab and Associate Director of the Data Inference Analytics and Learning Lab. Then we have Kanshu Rajaratnam, Director of the Data Science and Computational Thinking School at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Frank Dignum, Head of the Department of Computer Science at Umeå University today, and from tomorrow, I understand, also Director of Computer Science in a Free University in Amsterdam. Is that correct? And also he's the He's co-chairing with me the Ichka AI for Good Symposia in Africa, and he's leading research groups on socially aware AI that create computational models on social aspects such as norms, values, practices, and conventions. Tim Bonman, he's the community leader for Open Source Science OSI, a global non-focused initiative launched in partnership with IBM that aims to accelerate scientific research. He's also a community core team member at the AI Alliance that is working internationally to bring different stakeholders together towards open source in research. And that's all for this this panel. Well, that's all. It's a lot. That's a lot. So let me continue. Let's continue with this discussion, right? So Kanchu, from your experience in South Africa, there is a lot that has been talked about the inclusion of the global South, right? And I was last year in South Africa. That's how we met. And I was amazed with Frank on the good work, very, very good work that is being done. And actually, as Frank said before, the global North should be learning from the global South because we focus more on papers and in some of the research that is being done by and published in places like Deep Learning in Daba is very focused on the practice, right? So what do you think could be, what is the secret of what you are doing right, maybe in your organization?
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to sit on this panel. So, from my experience and from listening to the last two panels, one of the difficulties that's being repeated many times is the incentive to the interdisciplinary work at universities, I presume in the global North. At my university, that's not a problem. The school that I run was set up to do inter, trans, and multidisciplinary research in and for Africa. So, they incentivizing us to do such kind of research. But we do have other impediments, right? In the context of Africa, funding, the human capacity, not human ability, but human capacity. We have the ability to do stuff, but we don't have enough people doing stuff because the funding is not available. But I'm going to give you one example of an impediment to our research that I had in my experience. We really believe in open research and open data. And back in 2021, a gentleman at my school, Professor Tulio de Oliveira, he sequenced and announced to the world the Omicron variant of the coronavirus. What happened? Everybody shut us out. Right? So there was no incentive for us to be open about our science and about our data because it had such bad economic impact on the country as a result of us being so open. Right? There were other countries in the global North who also discovered variants who did not announce the variants, whereas we did, I believe, the right thing. And subsequently, when Omicron was found in other countries, of even with smaller economic impact and large economic impact on neighboring countries, they didn't lock them out, right? So this was a political decision that was implemented on South Africa. Fortunately for us, we still believe we did the right thing and we'll continue to doing that. But such kind of impediments on many other economies, smaller economies that are less resilient than South Africa, will have massive effect. So it's something that we need to think about politically, how we encourage open science and open research without having to punish a country for what it does. That's an example from my experience. I can go on about other stuff too, about funding and infrastructure, etc. But I think all of those when it comes to South Africa and Africa. Thanks.
Thank you, Kanchu. Frank, what is your opinion? Because you have a lot of experience on what's going on in Africa because you've been a researcher there, also in the global North. How can we make this work from a global perspective? You guys also have this microphone.
Yeah, maybe it's good to. Anyway, yeah. So one of the things. Let me get back to what Alex was saying from Google. All the money they give philanthropy. They said they make this project on flooding, and then you can predict more time before that the flood will come. And I right away thought, oh, there's been a project in Indonesia on exactly this in Jakarta. And do they know about it? No, probably not, because they would know that actually predicting that is not really the most important thing. It's getting the people to do the right thing after that. Do they trust the government that informs them about things? Who's the first one to leave their house and leaving it exposed to other people that will take their furniture? So the problem is not in the prediction of the flooding, it's about organizing the people. And so now, Virginia and me, we had been in Harvard the first 3 months of this year, and we talked a lot. This group is doing a lot of things on agents for health organizations, and very good things. But if you look at what they do, they pick out the cherries where their techniques actually can be applied. They don't really look at what are the actual problems that the people have. What are the things that we should be looking at? Because that it involves people, and people are difficult. So we don't really know what to do with our techniques. So I think one of the biggest struggles we have is that we as computer science, because I'm a computer scientist, we have to learn to look at the world and not through the lens of only computers, but actually look at the people first and see what we can do with our techniques for those people. And if we start doing that, suddenly you get completely different types of problems, very interesting research questions. And you also see that a lot of this talk about we don't have enough data and all that, I find that completely rubbish. If that's your perspective, you basically are very lazy, because you think if I have enough data, I can just solve it with the things I have. I don't have to think about new ways of doing things. And just one more example on having people first. I've had this conversation seriously with an Italian guest professor in Umeå who is doing doing image recognition for recognizing cancer. And they are doing a very good job. They are better than radiologists and all that. And then they tested their system together with the radiologists on real patients, and they noticed that the radiologist is not at all getting better. And they were very amazed. And that was like 2 years ago. I explained them in like 10 minutes why this is the case. It's very simple and intuitive if you look at the people involved. Now, I think 2 months ago, I saw an article in the Harvard newsletter, and they were saying the same thing. But it's very obvious. If you disagree, the system disagrees with the radiologist, what can happen? The system says it's cancer, and the radiologist doesn't believe it's cancer. He wants an explanation. And the system can only say, well, I've seen in so many cases, and this looks more like a case with cancer, but nothing that can convince a radiologist. If it's the other way around, radiologist thinks it's cancer, the system doesn't. Better be safe than sorry. So let's treat it like cancer. And if they agree, nothing changes either. So there's no case of all the different possibilities where the radiologist will change his opinion, because actually the system is not designed to explain when it is differing in opinion from the radiologist. And this is obvious. I mean, anyone that is trained as a radiologist needs to hear from a supervisor why he makes mistakes. So you have to be able to explain your things. Why are we not working? Now you get a lot of research on explainability, but most of that is in terms of things that don't really connect to medical people. It connects to other technical people. So why do we not do these things together with the people that we're making the systems for? And as long as that doesn't happen, then you actually cannot integrate those systems in the hospitals. Then we get to the second point. So this guy, he was very happy, very proud that their system this year was like 3% better than 2 years before. And I said, but what's the difference? First of all, your radiologist doesn't get better from it. But if you go to many places, it's not recognizing the cancer, but it's actually getting the people in time to the hospital to get the RMI or whatever they do to test them. And if you don't do that properly, then you don't really gain a lot. And of course, in big cities, maybe people go very quick, but in countrysides, and that's like in Africa happens a lot. But the same happens in the north of Sweden. People are remote. They are not all the time they're connected to hospitals going there. They only go there when they think, I'm really ill and I need to go, and then it's maybe too late. So that's a much more interesting problem, helping many more people than this 2% more accuracy. So why are we focusing on those things? Well, because it's very easy. You can publish on it. But I think we need to think about the things in a different way. And that is much more than using a technique, doing open data or anything like that. It's really putting the people first. And then from that perspective, look at what kind of problems we want to solve.
Yeah. So whatever comes out of here, I think it's clear to all of us that we have to start by identifying the problem we want to solve with the nonprofits, with the people that working in the ground, putting people first, and not as we are doing most of the time now is like, let's use this technique for whatever, since we have it, right? Because that doesn't work and doesn't provide a lot of added value. Thank you, Frank. And now, Tim, with the AI Alliance, we have an example of a structure that is actually doing and putting together academia and industry, right? And we were discussing just yesterday, what are the obstacles that we have identified and the work that you're doing to actually generate the right incentives for everybody, right? So it's a kind of a case study. So can you tell us a little bit?
Sure. Can you hear me okay, everyone? All right. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. So my name is Tim Bonneman. I work at IBM Research. I'm a longtime, so I'm neither a scientist nor very technical. I'm a longtime community builder. In December, I got pulled into an initiative that is hopefully going to be a case study for effective collaboration, right? So it's called the AI Alliance. It was co-founded by IBM and Meta and another 50 organizations at the time. It's now grown to over 100. Includes large companies like AMD and Intel and Hugging Face startup, but also I think about 30 academic institutions, including from Switzerland. We have ETH Zurich, we have TU Munich was on the panel here just before, and many others, and of course Notre Dame also, right? And the basic premise is that in order to develop safe and trusted and beneficial AI, we probably want to do it in the open with open, transparent innovation. And whether that's regarding the models or the tools or the data or the processes connecting all these elements, right? So we want it to be done in the open, and that's what these organizations have committed to supporting. And now we're trying to figure out how we actually get that done. And so for these first few months, we've been busy getting organized. There are 6 focus areas going from education and skill building and policy and advocacy to the technical areas of trust and safety, tooling, models, and also hardware. Yeah, and some of the challenges are definitely technical. Especially, I think, as we're getting into the more domain specific, which was mentioned at on the first panel also, right? As we get more into the domain specific use cases, I think it's going to be increasingly important to have all the stakeholders at the table, so to speak, right? And have experts from different areas come together, including from academia, and inform the in both directions, right? Inform each other how to build the right systems. And policy, there's also challenges, because if you've been following the legislative efforts in both Europe and the US, there have been some maybe well-intentioned but in effect, very harmful proposals towards the use of open source that would have been massively restrictive on the use of open source. So that's something that the AI Alliance also is hoping to do, inform decision makers and legislators about the benefits of healthy open source systems with regards to AI. Yeah, and we're starting to get, this is definitely intended to be a hands-on and builder community. So it's not supposed to be just a discussion circle. It's in fact intended to enable large numbers of developers to build applications, to work with models around the world. And we're starting to see these various working groups to produce tangible output. So there have been a couple of white papers. There have been, I think, a couple of responses to various policy proposals. And we're seeing, I think there's now a living document on the trust and safety, like a living guide to introduction to trust and safety. So we're starting to see them become productive. And it's an exciting initiative. It's open. You can, if you're interested, you can, get in touch to either for your organization, become a member, but also individuals are welcome to, swing by and contribute.
Can I just ask you, how are you solving the obstacle of the incentives, right? Because we were discussing that, of course, it was very obvious that from academia, we have some incentives, from industry, some others, and it's very clear in the discussions. And now you're working on how to make this kind of worthwhile for everybody, right? Because otherwise people just drop off.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of my jobs. We're also, expanding the team of community for the AI Alliance, and that's top of mind, right? How do we make it worthwhile for both the organizations, the member organizations, also the individuals who are working in these working groups, and of course, because the intention is to have a very diverse global community that combines, large industry, corporations, startups, nonprofits, academia. How do we make that work, right? And so I think we're getting there. It's a work in progress for sure. But we did have a first in-person workshop in April, and it was very fun to see the energy and the excitement when folks actually get into the same room and can hash out some of the ideas they've been discussing. So I think we're going to make some good progress.
That's actually a very good point. It's very simple, kind of like, it's kind of obvious, right? But getting people physically, I mean, in the same space, right, and discussing helps so much, right? Yeah. And I was in this meeting and was really productive. Okay, so Nuno, I know that you're leading a very interesting projects that have an impact on what we call here good AI for good. And maybe what would be your recommendations on, or what are your thoughts of all these discussions that have been taking place?
Recommendations, I wouldn't dare. But it's a general comment. I think, I mean, after 3 panels, there's a lot that has already been said. So no point in kind of going over that. But it is true. There's a structure of incentives problem, both in academia, kind of a scoping issue, probably in the connection between academia and industry. There's a lot of things missing. So you come up with the following question is, how do you bridge those things? I have no bullet or silver bullet for that, because from all the experience that I've had, all the experience that I've kind of drank from people around me, when you're trying to do something around the realm of AI for good, and there's ample discussion on what that should mean or actually means, they always start with discussions on what the problem is and not the kind of how do I fit my tech into it. This has already kind of also been put on display. But there's a kind of a thing I would like to touch. It's kind of a story, more or less funny. I organized a Portuguese AI conference last year. It was in my hometown in the Azores, so 2 hours from Lisbon by plane. So in the middle of 1/3 of the way to the US from Portugal. And because I was born there, I said, AI is a big topic. I'm going to organize a public session, going to prohibit everyone from coming from the conference, of course, just asking 2 or 3 people to come and just ask people, what do you want to know about AI? It actually, for me, it was great, but it was mayhem. It was mayhem because it got to a point where one of my colleagues, there was more discussion in the panel than with the audience. Because at some point, the discussion developed because one of the speakers essentially was trying to convince the audience that the work he was doing was for their benefit. And I must say, if that's where you're coming in, the problem is already there. Right? And I think we see a lot of that, and I think that's the challenge. We've all already spoken about it. Developing something that has actually impact, and impact, we should look at sustained impact, not just a drop in the bucket. Sustained impact requires building relationships, following through, thinking about the last mile in terms of policy and all of the regulation that will sustain it, the structure of fundings, all of those things. And I'll be honest, from a computer engineering, computer scientist side, I feel very much ignorant a lot of times that these things come up. And that's why most of the work that I do around these topics are always with very big teams. But big teams requires a lot of time to build them. Just to build a shared dictionary of what things actually mean takes a ton of time. Actually figuring out how these things can play out, who's in what place, how things can be deployed. These things take a ton of time. And beyond the incentive part, I think there's a piece there that is more foundational from the academia side, which is it is true that we need to double down on the capabilities and the abilities of students in kind of pursuing scientific goals and what's not. But we also need to be aware that, especially in the automated decision-making, deployment of intelligence systems or pseudo-intelligence systems in the real world, we kind of enter a realm for which we were not trained to evaluate the impacts of these things. We are not trained, at least we can acquire that. I'm not saying that we generally don't have that ability, but we were not trained to think about the issues in design of a solution in terms of societal impact, not architecture. That is our thing. And building the solutions. And then on things like the interface and the impact that interfaces have in the way that then medium to long-term impacts may have on engagement and changing or individual impact. So just coming back around and starting all over, beyond the Messiah complex or the pseudo-Messiah complex that sometimes we may have, there's no silver bullet. And the only thing that I've seen that works, learning a lot with Nitesh actually on this, the first point or the starting point for all of these AI for good projects is always a conversation. If it starts with, I have a technology for you, I have never seen, I may be wrong, never seen that develop into a sustainable relation, which is what we need, right? That's my 5 cents.
That summarizes very well a lot of the things that we have said. And I was also thinking when you say about sustainable impact, that is also impact in, oh, no, I don't like the word impact because it also has the impression that we do something and has an impact, right? Like providing sustainable solutions or sustainable collaborations. And also in terms of policy, are we contributing to positive policy making or to helping policymakers, right? And so I don't know if now we do have 5 minutes. So if there are contributions from the audience, okay.
Thank you. This is working, yes. So hi, my name is David Ekstrand. I come from Sveriges Ingenjörer, the Engineers of Sweden. We're a trade union which organizes 170,000 graduate engineers in Sweden. And I have one general reflection to start off with, and that is that this summit is a huge learning opportunity, I think, for many people, but a lot of people talk about involving a variety of stakeholders and civil society and so on. And I'm not sure I'm hearing their voices here during these days. That's just a general remark. And not least the trade union movement, I think there's a lot of space for constructive dialogue, which isn't really being met here, but I think at both national, regional, and global level, because just like you said, I mean, with the societal impact of automated decision-making systems, I mean, I could go on and on listing examples about how AI solutions can both positively and negatively impact working lives, the rights of workers, et cetera, and I'm not really hearing that being taken into account. Now, on a more constructive note, I speak a lot to like our members and industry leaders and people from academia and so on in Sweden. Everybody's saying that for people basically with, I mean, in the future, people, regardless of their field, many will need to know a bit about AI, and AI specialists will need to have domain knowledge. And I think that's sort of what I'm picking up on here. Now, coming from a white-collar union in the global north, this is a problem which is difficult, but not perhaps intractable. We can put on more university courses, lifelong learning, etc. But I'm wondering, like, surely there's a need here globally. Like, you have users and recipients of these systems and solutions who need at some level to understand, these systems that will impact, if that's the right word, their lives, hopefully, like in a good way. So basically, my question is, how do we provide opportunities for AI literacy within this context? Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely something we can incorporate in our kind of proposal, because education from Francesca also in the first panel, it was something that was mentioned, right? How to educate ourselves further, as Nuno was saying, than computer science, but more on ethics and on the main topics that we're tackling, right? And also, I wanted to ask, I don't know if we have here, let me see.
Can I just,
Oh, yeah.
I think it's interesting to talk about AI education. I agree that we need to educate, but we need to learn to use AI like we learn to use a car. We don't need to know all the details, but we have to have a very good idea about how it is used, how that interacts with others, and all that. Then I get back again to this interview of yesterday with Sam Altman, which more or less said, well, we have something which we think can become a car. We don't really know yet how it will work or whatever. We just throw it in and everyone can start using it. And then it becomes a kind of very difficult to educate people about it, because we don't really have, AI is not one thing. People now start using machine learning as being AI, but AI is a lot more than machine learning. And even within machine learning, it's very broad kind of a number of techniques. And so it's very difficult if companies like OpenAI throw things into the world that are kind of half-baked and then say, well, and people need to know how to work with that. I think there is a responsibility of the companies as well to be a bit more careful, so that you can actually teach the people how to act responsible and know what things can and cannot do. And so I've been giving a lot of presentations on the limitations of ChatGPT. And so one of them, it's always very, I can make this one. You ask ChatGPT, can you make a joke about gay people? And it gives a very socially acceptable answer. No, you cannot do that with all this kind of things, characteristic of people. You cannot do that. Can you make a joke about tall people? Well, I can ask that. And he says, sure, I know an interesting joke about tall people. So let me tell you the joke. It's a tall person comes into the bar with a letter on his shoulder. the bartender asks him, "Why do you carry a ladder?" And he says, "Well, I heard the drinks are on the house." Which, I mean, this is a replace tall with black person is exactly the same joke, but even worse. So I made a picture of a hut in Sweden. If you're tall, you don't need the ladder. You can get up the house anyway without using the ladder. So there are many different things where this is completely wrong. But ChatGPT comes with this kind of flukes, and you never know when they come, and people actually don't really notice them. Another thing I use that give me the bio of Frank Dignum, and it comes a nice story, and it's like more than half of it is from Virginia. So I'm okay with that, but maybe she is not okay with that. But would you notice it? No. Well, if you know us well enough, you can see it. It lists 5 universities I'm connected to. None of the 5 is correct. They're actually mostly in the right countries, but they're wrong university. So what happens if people start using this? And we don't know. So there are so many of these things where it can do very nice things, but you don't know when it messes up. So there are no guarantees. So how can you teach people to use something like that if you don't really know what it actually is doing, whether it's correct or not? And I find that very irritating, because I completely agree that we need to educate people to use these kind of tools. But what do you actually educate people with? Say, check all the facts that ChatGPT gives you. Wow. I mean, why? That's kind of counterintuitive. So what else do you want? And
I would just like to add. I mean, it's kind of irritating, annoying, but also dangerous. It kind of brought me to work I'm doing with a colleague in Croatia, which is about a topic or kind of a term I've never heard before, which is memory modulation. I don't know if anyone here knows what that is. Essentially, what you would use in, for example, post-conflict, is that part of the conflict where you kind of go through how you tell the history, the museums, how do you change it, how do you change the education manuals, all of that. And I was having a lunch with her at Notre Dame, and I asked her at some point, to what point is Claude, ChatGPT, and all of those things memory modulation tools? So we got to kind of research that. And the dangerous part is that you get to the conclusion that with those tools, the veracity or factuality of historical and key, very conflict-driven or potential events are told in very different ways, potentially conflicting ways. And when you think about the way that these things are being used massively, for example, with students, you have this idea that when you think of something like cognitive warfare, no longer the idea of the victor writes history or they come together and write history. Now you have a thing which is the one that produces more data on their version of the history can be told. And that is the beyond irritating part, which is how these things are fallible to a level that is dangerous at the societal level. That's kind of the concerning part.
There is a comment from the audience. Oh, 2 comments.
Sorry.
I'll be quick because I know I spoke before and I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Alice Liu with Baraka Impact Finance, which is a Geneva-based firm bringing impact investors and global health entrepreneurs and LMICs together. But before that, I was doing responsible AI and working in international development generally in ICT for D and digital health and so on. So, but to the point about education, so there are a number of initiatives. I'm sure there's many, but I just your comment reminded me of this. Something I learned from someone in Los Angeles who is working in the Los Angeles Unified School District to teach about technology, including AI. And what was interesting, I was asking, so what is the student profile like? And then actually a lot of people, actually a lot of them are people 50 and up, because they thought they could retire, but they realize they can't, and they need to learn about AI because now they realize they have to work for another 10, 20 more years at least. And they have to understand this. And I think back to the car analogy, I think we have to remember this is also early days really for AI. People are wowed by it, but we all know it's still in its infancy. And you just reminded me, I think in the early days, if you see movies, because obviously we weren't born when cars were invented. Do you remember in these old movies where they're cranking the car to get started and it won't start? So cars didn't work very well either in the beginning. So I think we're kind of we have to set people's expectations. This is still pretty inconsistent, rickety, the rickety type of technology. So we have to kind of try and put some of the hype down. Anyway, that's all.
So the thing with the car is when we cranked it, we knew when it worked and when it didn't work, right? With AI, we don't know when it's giving us the wrong answer.
Quick. It's building off of this conversation, we're talking about all the errors that can go into ChatGPT, but we aren't, there's also the whole other side of the things that just don't even exist in there. So we had a conference in Ghana last year, the Responsible AI conference, and someone brought up the point that if you ask ChatGPT, how do you say banana in Twi, one of the languages there, it doesn't know the answer, right? I mean, so like we're talking about errors that actually only revolve around a certain part of the world or a certain part of the population, and is growing the gap between other parts of the population that won't be able to use the tool at all, even if it is incorrect. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ben Marinich from Rock Labs. We work in medtech, specifically endocrine hormone projects. I'm just wondering, is open source LLMs really the only way, really the only way we can do this because of the opaqueness of companies like OpenAI, which they should probably reconsider rebranding their name. Because we really need to understand how these things work. There's degrees of open sourceness, whether it's the paper, the weights are open sourced, all of those kinds of things, because we need to understand how these things work, and do we need to have standardization applied to them, ISO standards, those kinds of things, so that I'm working with researchers so that they can have a degree of confidence and understanding of what they put in and what is being spat out whilst they're doing these research projects, to understand that there's safety and consistency in the inferences that are provided.
Yeah, I can quickly, so if I mentioned the term open source AI, I should have been more careful. The definition of what makes open source AI is actually still being worked on. There's the Open Source Institute that's having a project. They're coming out, I think, with the beta in June next month. They plan, at least. There is a Linux Foundation has the degrees of openness framework that they put out recently. And then there came out an article recently from a workshop at, I think, MIT, that also looked at the same thing. So I think we're still working on the definitions. I think what the Alliance is doing, the intent definitely is to be, open. In how it's going to be defined in detail is still up for grabs, right? I had one more thing, but did you want to also, or anyone else? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you again for this discussion. I think that maybe I would like to make a last comment on the topic of education, because of course we cannot know about absolutely everything, right? I mean, but I think that the first point is to realize that we need to learn more, like that we are ignorant. I think that being more humble, and maybe personally, that's something I missed yesterday on the interview with Sam Almond, like being more like, we need to learn a lot about ethics. We need to learn a lot about social science, about cognitive science. You know what I mean? And I think that's the first step. And being surrounded by the right experts I think that's also important. So we're going to have a break now for 45 minutes. So we have to be back here at 12:45. And then we're going to have a discussion with people from the Young Presidents Organization on how whatever we want to do, we can make it economically sustainable so that we can actually make it happen. And we go from words to action. Okay, that's going to be at 12:45. So see you later. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back. As we said before, now we're going to figure out together how we can translate all those things that we said in the morning, the things that don't work, things that do work into practice, and what would be the next steps. And for that, we have here two panel speakers, Ahmad Butt. He is a serial entrepreneur with 25 years in finance and deep tech as a founder, investor, operator, and mentor. He has founded and scaled and exited a multi-billion fund. And he's also the chairman of different technology ventures and many other things. But just to be fast, I will leave it here because some of these panel speakers have to actually catch a flight in just a very few minutes. And then Gerasimos Spiridakis, passionate about technology, both investor, connector, and coach, helping technology entrepreneurs, founder and CEO of several companies. And both of them are part of the Young Presidents Organization, YPO. There are also other YPOers in the room today, and they're going to help us to figure out how can we go from words into actions. So I think that we agreed from the discussions this morning that some things are not working, right? We don't have the right incentives. There is a lot of funding going into both universities and also provided by organizations like Google.org and others. But they not always have the desired effects that we want. Like there is a gap between the research that we do and the implementation. We're not always aware of the real needs of the stakeholders that are working in the ground. So we have to do things differently. And here, Ahmad, please, could you maybe give us some indication of what could be the next steps for us to work on?
Should I use this? Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. So as Georgina was saying, that I'm a recovering quant hedge fund founder, and I've been spending the last sort of 20 years of my life thinking about how to systematize decision-making and commercializing new technologies that are coming out of our own fund and new strategies, but also outside. And I think there's I don't know if the group agreed on this, but at least from my vantage point, there's a crisis in innovation, and you need to really unshackle research. And there are many reasons. The incentive structures perhaps need a little bit of an updating. It's a supply-led system, so researchers are working on what they like to work on, rather than a demand-led system where we have a lot of problems in the world. We have a lot of outcomes we want to achieve, from climate to longevity to financial inclusion, and people and researchers are not working on that, and the models are not the incentive models are not supporting that. And then the inclusion. It's I care about that a lot because I came from a third world country, and to go to Carnegie Mellon, where I studied robotics and engineering back in the day, it was hard. It was dominated by only 18% of PhDs who do a spin out are not white males. So there's some issues that we need to resolve, and one of the things that we have been doing for the last 6.5 years is we've basically created an alternative path to commercialization. So from idea and from outcomes, we start with an outcome, we reverse engineer the techno-economics and the commercial needs, and we focus on the constraints and try and remove the hard constraints by either creating new knowledge or doing combinatorial science to get to the outcome we need to get to in our lifetime. And we've spun out 42 companies. They have scaled touch wood, they have scaled to, we probably raised over $1 billion in aggregate in these 42 companies, and they're very much mission aligned. So, we are trying to solve pediatric oncology. We are trying to remove gigatons of carbon from the air. We are trying to create trillions of joules of safe aviation fuel. And you realize that it's the same researchers working with the top labs, but because the incentive structures are not connected to the universities and the founders are incentivized to build these companies, but we still have access to 32 national labs who are partnering with us. The top labs in the world, they're saying, we will get our PIs interested in these cohorts because they're doing these great outcomes. So we understand that everyone understands the need. It's just like to have a framework. So I've been discussing this also with YPO, and which is a big business organization, and Gerasimo can probably talk a little bit more about this, where there are business leaders who are very much aligned with wanting to make impact in the world. And I think there's a model, whether it's a focused research organization, whether it's a orthogonal institute that has venture creation and fundamental theoretical research at the cutting edge of the constraints that need to be removed, that's being done, where we can work in a more harmonious way with the right incentives, the right inclusion structures, and with the right recruitment to actually build and create these outcomes. I think it's a necessity. It's our moral obligation to now want to do that, and that's what we are trying to do.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. So if I understood correctly, maybe your recommendation or your comment would be, we could create structures which are partnering with universities and have alternative incentives so that favor having this impact. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there's a big problem with the supply and the demand side. So I think you need to start with the scope of what outcome a collective needs to create, and then you need to work backwards in thinking about how can we create that outcome that can commercialize without any constraints from anyone, right? That has to be the first, that blank sheet of paper has to be at the core of this. And then you spend a lot of time doing your scientific scoping with a lot of rigor, with a lot of first principle thinking, bringing industry in on day one, your first customer on day one, thinking about the techno-economics in a much more involved manner. So industry has to be on that table. And 80% of the 42 spinouts that we've done, they have been done with consultation with Cancer Research UK or Anglo American or industry, which comes in on day one and says, we are 100% aligned. If this thing was to exist, we would fund it. But these are the specifications of the thing that we think needs to exist. And then there's a debate. There's a 12-month to 18-month scoping that just you don't start building till you actually know what you're building. So at least that's the approach that we've taken, and we've seen many different alternatives or different alternatives to that. There is the name escapes me now. Adam Marblestone, Convergent Research. They're an FRO. They're doing specifically that. Gary Michelson with the Berkeley National Labs. They're doing that around immunotherapy. So they're saying these are the specific contraindications we're going after, and we're going to fund researchers who will come and use our space. And we'll partner with the University of Berkeley for their labs, but we're going to fund these completely outside that ecosystem. So yes, there's a partnership model. And, I think they're going to be 80% of existing universities will want to embrace that, and maybe 20% won't, but we'll see how that works out.
Very interesting. Thank you. Gerasimos, what is your view on all this? Would you say to us, because we've been discussing all morning, this is not working, the incentive system is not working. We want to do it well. We want to have impact. How do we do that, in addition to what Ahmad was explaining?
Yes, thank you. So Ahmad and I represent an organization. There's a couple of other friends in the room, which is the largest CEO organization in the world. We are almost 34,000 CEOs globally, and we are responsible roughly for 10 trillion of dollars of wealth and assets. So we have some, I think, good visibility of what is missing at the moment, and building to what you just said. I'll talk a little bit more simplistically because I cannot compete in the way you spoke earlier. It was very, very, very good. I would say for me it's a matter of it's a matter of execution. There's a lot of people out there that they are very good in articulating a vision, and they present very well. They demonstrate, a very feasible, let's say, business model. They showcase a lot of good examples, partnerships. But at the end of the day, if the execution is not there, it's really, really hard. And I think, as most of people in this room are business people, I think they would agree with this approach. So it's about execution, it's about delivery. And as an investor, when I speak to investors, because part of what we do in my company is we invest capital for institutions and organizations and also individuals. At the end of the day, yes, they're very happy to look for investment returns that that are linked to sustainability and good causes, but medium to long term, they also need to get performance. So people will be a little bit, I would say, more accommodative in the beginning to swallow, excuse me, my word for a better word, some, let's say, mediocre or not great returns because the cost is good, and that can take you for some time, but eventually, as an investor, you really need to go to performance. So I think that the objective would be how can we bring the two worlds together, how we can focus not on education but on learning, and how can we bring the labs be more, let's say, relevant to what the business community wants. And if we are able to do this, I think we will see very different results for the investment community. Because at the end of the day, you need the investment community to provide capital, but they need to see returns as well. So it's a good marriage between the two, and I think this is how I would phrase it. Yeah.
Thank you, Gerasimos. And Amir, you're a super expert as well. We know that we have founded a lot of projects in AI for good. And what would be, based on what Ahmed and Gerasimos have explained, what would be your recommendation for a step forwards here? Because we have big players, right? In research, in academia, in industry, in the room, the UN. What do we need to do now to, make this compatible with what Ahmed and Gerasimos are saying?
Thank you. Borrowing from the conversation from this morning, there is ample evidence today that we have the knowledge and the research capability to implement solutions that are directed towards making an impact with AI. The question is scalability at two levels. One, scalability is bringing product to product market fit, which is a language which is not an academic language, which is a market language, but also at the same time want to capture benefits to people, and that benefits to people can be translated to impact or some other words. Once that is achieved, then the question is that how these solutions can scale up, because they need to be provided to more people at a larger scale. Could that scale be geographic or more age groups or more cultural diversity? Scaling can be defined in many ways. So how can we scale it up? And usually there is a gap, and that gap is either covered by government funding, because there is a public good, there is something that is demonstrated, or philanthropy, or if there's a case for a scalable and sustainable, economically sustainable model, market realities will come into place and those solutions will survive. But in our survey of the past 8 years on AI for Good, and the investment that I've made personally and I've seen others make in research-initiated projects, probably less than 2% have ever made it as a commercial sustainable entity. So we have lots of demonstration of projects that have been impactful in domains such as in climate change or health for all or education or biodiversity in many aspects, but they don't even get the funding because there is no funding, or they don't get the funding because they cannot scale, or because they have not demonstrated safety and required for regulations. So putting all those aside, the funding gap can be achieved, the mechanism that Ahmed and Gerasimos mentioned, by finding a common ground between what is the impact that we can redefine, and impact could be probably scaling mechanism that is easy and fast and provide more more ways to be distributed to people. So if the public benefit can be measured in some ways, I think there is enough philanthropic money and invested money can be thrown into project. But there are two conditions. One condition is that those solutions and those projects have to be scientifically valid. They cannot just be one offshoot. There's no way to be robust, to be trustworthy, to be explainable, to be transparent, to have all the requirements of future regulations and future distribution. So if they're met those requirements, that's the first one. The second one is that it has to be outcome driven, as was explained by my colleagues. We cannot just be funding projects because they are cool and interesting. They have to be outcome driven. For instance, if you talk about health prevention or last mile of health, the last mile of health will involve probably healthcare workers, probably assistance with AI tools to bring more capability to people. That could be including machine vision, predictive mechanisms, many technologies of AI that could be put in hands of healthcare workers to really help them bridge the gap between lack of hospitals or nurses or doctors at critical moments and still be able to provide accuracy and reliable information back to the public. So this example, for instance, if this was properly framed, I think there is ample money that could be put to work. There was a research that would be directed to that outcome. So that's one example. So we need to find those couples of outcome-driven, research-oriented projects, and as suggested, form partnership with research institutions, not within the research entity necessarily, because the goal is not to do research is being done, but provide some form of public-private partnership where the outcome is defined upfront. Research can actually match that and say, okay, we can actually deliver that research and make sure we can fund researchers and fellows and others continue doing the work, being connected to the ground, make sure that solutions are implemented locally with local agency, and solutions could be sustained economically. So if these three conditions met, I think we can multiply by a large factor investment into what we call AI for good or AI for impact projects.
Okay, so question from the audience, Nuno?
Not needed. But
no, please, come on. We're here to discuss this.
No, not needed, but at home or something they may need.
Your voice carries well.
Thank you so much for that. I had a question for Gerasimos. It's a bit, so you were talking, it kind of caught my attention, the execution part, but that's something that you're informed by experience, because sometimes you have no idea of the capability of execution of projects. So I was trying to pick your brain on how do you approach that? How do you look at the project and the people that are associated to it, and you go through your mind assessing the capability or the probability of execution?
Thank you. I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest, and I think Amir alluded to this earlier. There's a lot of interest in business plans, a lot of interest in teams that they bring a lot of collective experience together, etc. But at the end of the day, what sometimes is missing is the ability to make decisions, the ability to pivot, the experience which comes over the years to face, the difficulties and move on. I mean, a combination of experience, which you can get by mentoring, by looking what works, what doesn't work. Sometimes some simple common sense makes a huge difference, and we all tend to see things very complicated, but sometimes things are much simpler than we think they are. I think the choice of the people you work with, and a lot of what we see with startups and organizations is it's a lot about ego many times. I think ego is one of the biggest issues that we face in every single aspect, that whether it's business, whether it's personal, etc. I think ego is always one of the main causes that is the distractor of value. So execution is about, you have a plan, as Ahmad said earlier, you can move backwards, but you need to be able to execute. There's a lot of people who can do amazing planning, amazing things, build an amazing narrative, an amazing story. The numbers look good. Everything looks amazing. There's a group of people, if you see at the Rolodex of the team, it's really an impressive group of people. But if they don't have the chemistry, if the ego does not prevail, if the ego prevails, then they cannot execute the plan. And at the end of the day, it doesn't work. And we see this many, many times, starting with small steps, going little by little, and know where you're heading. Or sometimes you don't know where you're heading, but at least, you fix on the go, right? I mean, sometimes you don't need to have a clear plan of a clear path of where you go. And sometimes you go to a totally different direction from where you started. But if you get this right little by little, and you can execute the task, and you pick your teammates and your colleagues very carefully, and you can correct mistakes on the spot without sometimes looking back. I think for me, this is what works with most of the cases. Yeah.
I'm going to add something to what Rasimo said. This is true for every startup. Number one, a startup failure is founders' disagreement or lack of alignment. But we're not talking about startup, we're talking about projects that have to be deployed. But the diversity of actors that come to play to make this work between researchers, scientists, policymakers, people on the ground, data scientists, engineers, funders, create a difficult set of people trying to understand why you're doing this together. And the execution at that time becomes difficult. Who's going to execute on what? So the ego is talking about is that sometimes publishing goals and career path, as you mentioned this morning, is an important part, and it has its own incentives. And on the policy side, framing a policy is just enough. We don't need to implement that policy. We just go to regulations, and some investors want something else. There's difficulties of that very little detail that makes it very difficult to push projects forward. And there is no rule book for that. The only rule book is a rule book of a project with startup mentality. And when they're scaling up, then they have to face the scaling issues as well on the spot.
And one last word is also about trust as well. We discussed it in a previous session. It's a lot about trust as well at every level, whether it's institutions, organizations, governments, private, etc. You have to have that in place. You cannot do business with someone you don't trust. That's it. It's period. I mean, this is probably the most important thing. From the very beginning, if there's no trust in place, personally, don't get.
That's the hardcore investor talking.
I think no, I think it's interesting what you're saying. It's kind of like very different from what we're taught in business schools, like the business plan and all that. Like we used to say, like a paper can look wonderful, but then the important thing is be able to rectify, be able to decide on the spot, to build trust and all the things that you're saying. And I think how to translate this in the research environment, right? Because we are putting all these efforts and we really want to make these things happen, right? And not be just papers, which are very good, but we want to have an impact, right? So as Amir was saying, it's a complex environment. And so that's what we're trying to figure out as a result of this, the next step.
Can I add something? We're not faced with a product market fit problem alone. We're faced with a lot of known unknowns where you still need research and science to be involved, right? Things are changing, evolving. We know so much right now, and then maybe we need to learn more. Maybe we have to evolve the approach. And that iteration is not just an engineering problem, is also a research issue. So bring researchers to be really privy to what's going on the ground and have data back is critical. So this playbook doesn't exist today efficiently. It exists from individuals that make it happen, but it's not a typical playbook. So it's not just a typical product market fit issue.
Right.
We still need to solve problems at the fountain level, at the source level, because we don't have all the truth and the unknowns are not in front of us always.
Okay, several people want to.
Amir, I had a related question. I mean, you touched on several different things, like especially different institutions, different organizations that need to come together and work together. There are cultural differences. Incentives are not necessarily aligned. Even the last piece that you talked about, even sometimes inside a company, the R&D culture versus the scaling up culture is going to be different. So how would you address a situation like that?
Do you want me to answer? Maybe you have an answer.
Oh, no, I had a question after that.
Oh, well, I think the answer was the proposal that was made was pretty much a form of public-private relationship with research organizations and with investors that are investors and those who are supporting project to come up with some joint effort. There is no playbook, as I said, there is no no written guidelines. It's just that we need to have people working together, and these two groups are usually not working together. Some researchers become amazing entrepreneurs and they create amazing companies, but the incentives are not to do that. The incentives are somewhere else.
I think it's also communication as well. Sometimes, you know, you have the both parties working with the right intentions. There's the right content. Based on what you just said, you know, having the research and the lab capabilities is important because it validates your assumptions. You cannot build a model if your assumptions is wrong. You need proper data, and you need the model to work, so that the research validates that, right? But communication sometimes is where that breaks everything.
Nitesh?
Now, I think first of all, I echo everything you all have said, and oftentimes, even if you think about research that has a translational societal impact, we don't quite think about the product market fit. We don't even understand, right? What's our addressable market space? Who are they? How is it going to delight them? Why are they going to use it? What are their incentives to use the product that you're giving them? We do nada, right? We just assume that I have this cool, sexy technology. Everybody has to love it just because it is cool and sexy, right? And I have a great paper backing it up. So I think that is a complete disconnect. And I speak from my own experiences when I started my companies, and the mindset I had over there is very different than the mindset I have in the university. Right? It's a complete different shift, and having someone pay for your product is way harder than writing a research proposal and getting it funded. Right? Because when you're sitting in a federal agency, you're deciding to fund a proposal, it's not your pocket that you're paying from, right? It's the taxpayers' money, and you're evaluating science. But when you're buying a product, it's coming from your pocket. Or the company that you're selling it to. And then it's a very good question about R&D and the corporation side. I think there has been a constant tension always. If we go back in time, Bell Labs tried to do some beautiful fundamental research, didn't survive the test of time. AT&T research. So companies that are trying to find a balance, because at the end of the day, if there is no product associated with the research, who is going to fund the research? Right? These are not universities or pure research labs, etc., to sustain that program. And even as a university, I think there's place for basic foundational sciences, like the lady who won the Nobel Prize for her for the vaccine for coronavirus. She was committed to doing basic science for decades, right? And UPenn had relegated her to the basement that your research isn't important. Then she got the Nobel Prize, and now she's the most celebrated. She's come out of the basement because of the contributions they made. So I think there's a place for that. And even within the world of AI, there's a place for let's think about algorithms, what they mean, their complexity, and everything else. But the reason we are here is AI for good, and that changes the dynamic. Right? So that's where the handshake between the product market fit, what's the problem, who are we trying to solve it for, and how does my innovation translate to that, becomes extremely important. Because now we have made the bridge to almost that startup world. And maybe the universities are extremely well equipped to do that pilot study, do the proof of concept, and then say, okay, now it's ready to go to somewhere else. And maybe there's a group of investors, etc. So, okay, now this could be a startup. And if there's a business model attached to it, that somebody has to eventually pay. Because one challenge, as Amir also said, that we have is, I can demonstrate societal impact 3 years, 4 years on a project. Great. But if I can't sustain it, it's useless. And I think that's the challenge we face ourselves with. We can get funding for basic research. We can get funding for demonstrating a proof of concept or a pilot, which is even pre-MVP. But then we even go to the MVP stage, money is out. And maybe that's where the private investors come in and say, now this has a feasibility attached to it. There's enough of a business plan that could be validated. Let's go.
Thank you.
And money goes fast, huh?
Yeah,
I can tell you this. It goes really fast.
Thank you, Nitesh. That's very good points. And there is another contribution there.
Yep. Thank you. Hi, my name is Cara Hansen. I'm the Program Director for the Global Health Research Programme at the UK National Institute of Health Research, which is a public funder of research. And I really liked all the things I've heard here about the research not being problem-driven and the incentive structure not being right. But I'm kind of stimulated by the all stakeholders bit in the rubric for this session. And what I'm not hearing anything about in the context of scale is government decision makers, right? People, so I work in the context of health systems, still much of which are publicly funded, right? So governments in the health system are making decisions about whether to adopt a new device, a new approach, a new service delivery configuration. And I haven't heard anything about understanding their evidence environments and how researchers can be bringing their understanding of that evidence, or those evidence needs, into their own research plans, right? So if I'm working in the UK, I know to get my device or my drug or my process approved, it's got to go through not just a regulatory process, but it has to pass a cost effectiveness test. So who's generating the cost effectiveness information that's going to enable somebody who sits behind a government health budget to say, oh yes, we should be doing this. This is better than the thing we're doing now. And so I find actually across many of the discussions we're having here about the innovation space, the idea that part of your product market, part of your demand actually is public sector demand as well, right? And so it's one thing to think about the commercialization side, but if these things are going to be adopted in the delivery of public services for good, then we have to also include those people in the conversation.
Great comment. I wish someone was on this table from the public side to talk about this. Maybe we missed the opportunity to frame that properly. The goal was not commercial success. Investors are looking at commercial success. We're talking about investors that want to do impact, that want to do impact investment. And there is no guideline about public good. Meaning at one point, we think that government will take over or find something beneficial and sustain it. We don't see how private could always sustain some public benefit. While public research is important, and research generally is funded by government and public money, the case for scaling, I don't think we hear any form of government narrative by saying we'd like to see more public services distributed to all citizens that have this kind of capabilities and this kind of market demand and this kind of security situations attached to them. So those requirements, those guidelines, the outcome that we were talking about, if those outcomes are published, I think many investors will come and fill the gap partly. But at the end, if this is a public service and public benefits, it has to involve some form of government entities and regulators. Private investors are not in that debate, right? They're not involved in that conversation. What they could hope, as Nitesh mentioned, is that if, let's say, coming back to my last mile of health example, if there's a demonstration that some form of scenario applications or project or solution can provide value, is going to be taken over by some form of government spending or government program, unless it's fully commercially sustained by itself. For instance, a health insurance might find a way to do it, but usually health insurance are also working with governments. So we're not always privy to those conversations, but from the AI for Good lens, which we have spent some time on, the first stage is that, can AI make impact? And in what ways AI can make an impact? Now we are realizing that we have to have, as mentioned this morning, we have to have good AI to make impact, AI that is safe and trustworthy, etc. But we don't know what impact means, right? This is something that we still need to define. We make some prediction, we make some pattern recognition with some form of mitigation. But from a public perspective, we don't know where we are going. There is no roadmap on where all these things should go. People are smart, but there is no necessarily clear guidelines there, except the SDGs. But the SDG indicators are not a roadmap either for investment.
may I ask a speculative question of you, ma'am, please? I miss your name, but so let's say that, so you're the equivalent of NIH in the UK. So let's say as the NIH, you fund some science and we show outcomes. And then you go, okay, this is good, the demonstration proof of concept with a 5-year runway of funding. And then let's say a social impact investor comes in and says, this could be great. Can the government be the biggest customer then and say, okay, we funded the basic research, they have demonstrated impact. We know from a health perspective, the population would get positively affected. It will reduce inequities, reduce disparities. We are ready to go. And then you become the biggest customer of a positive impact investment. So that way it sort of completes a full circle. Because then I think the challenge is that, I think any positive impact in any impact investor would still want to see an ROI. And the challenge becomes is how do you show that ROI in the long run? But if you have invested in that basic science, outcomes show it works, would you be able to be the customer of that investment?
Different between the research funders and the government department.
Of course. Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
The others might be interested in funding for the public too. I think the key is to have the researchers, we work very much at the implied end, right? Not researchers tell us your confidence in impact. Because not that you can guarantee the impact, but if this thing works, how are you going to get it? And one of those routes is indeed through the service delivery.
Got it.
I want to add to what Nitesh was saying that by the way, thank you so much for your comment. I totally agree with you. And we try to have government representatives, and this is something that is, in our to-do list. So you're totally right. My experience with governments is that sometimes we get the comment of, we cannot get this wrong. Like our public is the general public. So is this totally tested? Like, is this totally, and I totally get that point and I share it, right? So I do think that there is this need for this intermediary actor, as Nitesh was saying, like to have some funders of philanthropies or investors in between so that these technologies can be like validated. Exactly. And then you can be the customer, but I find it very difficult to have government as the immediate customer because maybe it's too experimental sometimes. Oh, totally. That totally agree. Yes.
I think it varies from government to government.
Yes.
Country to country, function to function. There are certain governments that they are becoming much more efficient and they have got the message and they do a pretty good job. There are other governments or organizations, international organizations, that they are much slower to adopt. So I don't see it as something that applies to pretty much everything. It's very specific to.
You're totally right. And sometimes it's easier to work at the local levels with local city councils than to work at the very more general country level because you can do things kind of smaller. Yeah, you're totally right. There is not a general rule.
Also, there is the way governments are organized in terms of data gathering. For instance, UK has data on almost everything, and is very connected. In US, all the agencies are not connected; they're disparate. And it's a federal state, so each state has a different thing. So gathering data about what works is much difficult. So also there's aspect of reading the signals and evidence back from the market and how it ties together. That is important. So countries have sometimes this disposition, like Singapore or UK or others, and some have less. So take that into account also will make a case about how each type of experiment could go faster and probably more gathering more evidence.
And again, talking about incentives, as we were talking this morning, the governmental agencies have still other incentives, right? And so we're again not aligned with that many times. And also often it happens that the government changes because the elections come, right? And these projects sometimes are long-term or mid-term. So it's like, okay, let's do this today, but anyway, in 6 months, I don't know if I'm going to be here anymore or not. And that also, again, is, well, another obstacle that plays in this ecosystem that we have to deal with.
Maybe we have to.
If you look at the governments, such as in the Middle East, you see the growth we have seen in Dubai, for example, where the government would step in and just make things happen. We now see it in Saudi. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and what I saw is pretty amazing. You know how the government steps in, makes decisions, makes things happen, and they intervene compared to a regime where, as you said, every 1 year somebody else changes, and then there is no centralized way of decision making and consistency. I think consistency is always a problem because governments change, people change.
Innovation, yes. Amir, you wanted to say something else? Oh.
Thank you. I'm Randall, and I'm with Lancaster University and also colleagues with YPO and some other things. Question on leadership learning for you, Erasmus and Amir, in a second. But first, a quick comment on the incentives. And I recall when I was a CEO and we had a big technology initiative, a lot of stakeholders in the room, it became pretty clear to amplify Amir's point around getting 100% alignment up front, that the North Star for us was replacing frustration with joy. And there's a lot of pain behind that comment. But my point is that there were people in the room that had to look in the mirror around their own intrinsic motivation, the organization's values around drivers, and as well the external rewards, is it bonuses or recognition or whatever that may be. And we could put that all into the basket of incentives, but this would be a larger definition of what we mean by incentives so that we can land on maybe a North Star and do course correction along the way. On leadership learning, the friends you hang around with, how are they developing their skills, no matter what sector, maybe outside of tech, but as leaders to engage in a meaningful way to leverage AI to help them do better, to execute more effectively, more efficiently, more profitably? And it sounds like it leans a little bit more to IDGs from what you were saying, Erasmus, internal development goals, meaning leaving your ego at the door and being resilient, and these other skills that, how does that support or link the pursuit of SDGs? What needs to develop? Where do you see skill level and leadership learning happening around you?
We deal and we deal with a lot of people, and I think I wouldn't necessarily put a mark that everybody does in the same way. I think with AI, people are trying to figure out how their business model is affected. There is a lot of existential, say, questioning for a lot of entrepreneurs today, as far as I'm aware, about the future of their business and what they need to do in order to stay current and relevant to the changes that are coming. There's very few people now, compared to even a few months ago, that would challenge that their business is not going to be affected to a very significant way. But not many at this phase, as far as I'm aware, are in a position to make a decision. A lot of them don't understand. They don't know how, and I think an opportunity there will be how can they get that sort of intelligence and knowledge. I wouldn't call it expertise, but some basic knowledge of how they can adapt and apply what's coming to their business. Now, for building this with sustainability, etc. I'm not sure, Randall, because what I see is there's a lot of uncertainty now. I think geopolitics are starting playing a very important role in what we see more and more. We may have difficult, we had inflation, we had some economic factors post COVID that it looks like we're facing now better, but now geopolitics are taking again a stage role. And there's a lot of confusion, and I don't think that at the moment, impact investing is going to be their top priority. They have a lot of other priorities, which is a challenge, and I don't know how this can be reversed. And it goes back to when I started today the conversation with you all. It was about execution, but it was also about performance, and you need to link performance to this. If you don't do that long term, it's not going to work. That's, I think, is a challenge here. Yeah, and of course, an opportunity for those who will be able to provide the returns and the performance.
Or question or anything else? Because otherwise, I think that this has been a great discussion. Well, I don't know, just also tell us what you think. From my particular point of view, it has been great. And I think that we have enough elements to work on to see what are going to be the next step forwards in practice, to be able to, if really we can do something more applied and that works towards bringing academia, industry, and the UN working together on specific projects that are impactful on AI for good. Amir, I don't know. I think I would like you to say to conclude the maybe the session.
Thank you very much. Well, the whole premise of AI for Good Summit was based on these discussions about how we can create new leadership, as you said. The problem with leadership is that there is no internal gauge of measurement. You have to have alignment and similar language. I think the conversation we're having today leads to the discovery that we need to form new methods of collaboration that have common metrics, and those metrics have to be agreed upon by all the stakeholders. And we have now topics like product market fit or returns on investment, which are not important in the scope of AI for Good. I think SDG indicators by themselves are just a measure of progress by each country and the contribution to the SDG. They're not important. Impact investors are working with indicators that are called proof of impact, and that proof of impact is based upon different topics. If we can frame some collaboration where there is funding for researchers to be involved on project on the ground and sustain that effort, I think it's going to be a good step to make progress. We need to implement, we need to experiment, we need to gather data and collectively look at that data to see what it means and form new methods of collaboration. SDG 17 is the goal of collaborating. And we need to put that into action. And I think that's what we're trying to do by humbly saying we're here and ready to invest and to provide contribution, but we don't have all the tools and all the answers. But there is definitely a desire to do so.
But we have you, Amir. And that's enough. He's the founder and he's the guy behind the person behind AI for Good. And I think it's a great privilege to be able to share our thinking with you, because you are pretty much behind what you started with some other people 8 years ago, and look where it is today from where you started. So I think it's very humbling to be in a conversation, and because you bring so much knowledge and expertise in this.
Don't thank me because it's not important. ITU did this part, right? Your own agency is playing the game by saying we're going to bring people together. We have proven power. We bring they have startup competitions, their exposure, but we need to bring more researchers, right, to the surface. Researchers need to be involved in these discussions, that center. Yeah. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.